The estate was completely immersed in the night, in total darkness, and there was no light in any of the windows. On the table, among the books, there was an ice pack ready. Diana thought she had been used to this for a long time, but she felt uncomfortable every time. Perhaps it was because of the gray and chilling eyes, whose owner looked at Diana like a hungry animal. When they first met, she couldn't even imagine that he would look at her with that gaze. Diana asked Albert where this time, and he replied that today it would be the cheek. Albert leaned over Diana and looked at her with a cold and penetrating gaze. He added that he was wearing a uniform and gloves, so today it would be better to do it on the cheek. Diana suggested that Albert take off his gloves, but he refused, saying his hands were very cold. He opened the bag and, taking out a piece of ice, said he would now check how much his temperature had changed. Diaz. Diana put ice on Albert's forehead and said that today he wasn't as cold as before. She added, looking him in the eyes, if he suddenly feels hot, he should definitely say so. But Diana, even from a distance, felt that Albert was breathing out a strong chill. He didn't change, and the ice only melted in Diana's hands. He looked at the girl and said that she knew very well that he never felt hot. Diana replied hopefully that the day would come when Albert would feel warmth. The young man pressed the ice harder against his head, and sighing, replied that such a thing was unlikely to happen. But when Diana was 19, an event occurred that completely changed her life. She had an accident, and after the accident she was able to be reborn, but this rebirth was very unusual. She became the heroine of one of the novels she loved to read in a past life. While reading these novels, her hands grew cold and her heart began to beat rapidly. Because the plots were simply unpredictable, and the author was a genius. A novel is interesting when it remains on the pages of a book, but if you are its hero, then it is a completely different feeling. Diana sat in the living room opposite her brother Andrew, and assured him that he had misunderstood everything when she saw Charlene talking to another man. Andrew replied that maybe it was her brother, but Charlene herself said she liked someone. Andrew was handsome and Diana's older brother. He suffered constantly and worried about nonsense. Diana smiled and, pointing a finger at her brother, asked him if he had thought that he was the person Charlene liked. When Andrew replied that this couldn't be, Diana understood that these two heroes would suffer another 3 years of nonsense. And they wouldn't understand each other, according to the novel's plot. Charlene Raffaello was one of the main protagonists of the novel, and now she thanked Diana that. A year later, the engagement between Charlene and Andrew would take place. Since she was little, Diana did not attend many events and did not have the opportunity to meet Charlene. But when they got to know each other better, it turned out they were the same age and had a lot in common. But at some point, they became very good friends, because Diana made a lot of effort to bring the main characters closer. Charlene and Andrew. Finally, the day of the engagement arrived. This was the best reward for Diana. For her effort, Diana looked at her friend and told her that the dress she decided to wear suited her very well. Charlene laughed and replied that they chose this dress together, and that no one knew her better than Diana. Diana said that there were still some things to prepare, so she would go first, and that she would really look forward to seeing Charlene at her engagement party. Getting into the carriage, Diana thought that Charlene's parents should have taken care of the engagement, but they died early. And her brother was too far away. Charlene must have felt lonely in this mansion, but after the engagement, everything will change. And she will be happy. And then she saw a gentleman on horseback who told the servant that he had a letter from Duke Albert and asked him to open the gate. The servant gave the gentleman a personalized medallion as a pass and asked him to return it after leaving the mansion. The gentleman rushed past the carriage, and Diana wondered what urgent news there could be on the day of the engagement. She suggested that perhaps Duke Albert regretted it and wrote in a letter that he could not attend his sister's engagement. Diana felt goosebumps run over her body at the appearance of this gentleman. And she felt cold. She tried not to think about it, but to focus all her thoughts on her best friend's engagement. After a while, the carriage entered the palace gates, where the event marking Charlene's engagement would take place. And Andrew's. Everyone waited for Charlene to arrive, but instead of her appearing, a letter arrived saying she was breaking off the engagement. Diana dreamed a lot about seeing her brother Andrew and her friend Charlene in front of the altar. She imagined the happy faces of two loving people who had received a blessing. She had already seen the happy faces of their loved ones who accompanied the young couple at the beginning of their life together. Diana was very worried that her brother Andrew would get drunk from boredom starting that day. Moreover, according to the plot, a villain appeared who gained Diana's trust and tried to slander her by accusing her of being responsible for the broken engagement. But she had played the role of Cupid for so long that her friend and her brother were happily married. Finally, Charlene arrived, and Diana learned from her friend that she had indeed broken off her engagement with Andrew. And she asked her the reason. After all, her brother had just been shining with happiness and suddenly became gloomy. They were really not in harmony before their engagement. Diana took her friend's hands and felt her tremble all over. Charlene said that the engagement break was due to a very important reason. She added that a gentleman from the northern lands had arrived and brought a message from her older brother. That he could only read now. Charlene told Diana that her older brother, Albert, did not allow her to get engaged to Andrew. She added that, apparently, the brother simply thought she liked someone. But when he learned about the engagement ceremony, he did not allow it, as he did not personally know the person with whom his sister wanted to connect her life. At that moment, Andrew approached and Charlene told him that she did not want to break the engagement because of him. Because their relationship was truly real. Then the servant approached and whispered something quietly in Charlene's ear. The girl apologized to Andrew and Diana and said she needed to leave for a while. Andrew took care of Charlene and asked Diana to catch up with her. Diana asked why he couldn't do it himself, but Andrew replied that he would run to the end of the world for her. The brother replied that if he left now, bad rumors could spread among the guests. Diana decided to help Andrew and told him she would be back soon. She entered the room where her friend was supposed to be and could not believe what she saw. Charlene was in the arms of a man and was crying on his chest, and he was trying to calm her down. And then she saw his gray eyes, his chilling gaze, like a mist that appeared. And disappeared. Only one thought came to Diana's mind. Charlene could cry so calmly on this man's chest. This is Duke Albert. Diana visited the Raffaello family home, and therefore often saw portraits of her brother. And her sister. Charlene looked like a shining blue lake, and her brother gave the impression of a very cold person to whom all interests were alien. Those portraits were painted when Andrew was 12, and now that he is 24. Diana has seen how his figure has changed after defeating many monsters. His hair was no longer so silver, but his gaze was just as chilling. When Albert put on his helmet, Charlene asked if her brother was really leaving right now. But he replied that he had written all this to her in a letter. Seeing his sister's tears, he told her that she should sit down and calm down and that he would close the door. Then he met Diana's gaze and said there was no need to stay at the door. If she wanted to come in, she could, but if not, then she should leave the room. Diana was very surprised by his words and considered his behavior terrible. From Charlene's stories, Diana knew Albert lost his parents at the age of 16 and received the title of Duke. From a young age, he saw the entire dark side of aristocratic society. But Albert's attention has always been on his younger sister, Charlene. The imperial palace watched Albert silently and waited for the moment, trying to discover his weak point. Diana decided to help her friend calm down and wanted to enter the room. She walked to the door and opened it with a strong push. And then she ran into Albert at the door and accidentally touched his chest with her hand. The next second, she instantly recoiled and pulled her hand away because she felt a strong cold. And unbearable. Albert decided not to interfere in the girls' conversation and left the room. When the friends were alone, Diana said that Charlene's eyes were swollen from crying so much, and that her makeup was ruined. She then added that if the bride appeared before the guests looking like this, everyone would think it was a marriage of convenience. Having seated Charlene in front of the dressing table, Diana thought that she should not mention what she recognized in the gentleman as her brother Albert. She asked her friend if she was really crying because of the gentleman who came from Duke Raffaello. Charlene replied that the gentleman had brought a letter from her brother Albert, which greatly upset her. Charlene said that the gentleman would stay here for another month and that Diana would have found out about the letter anyway. The message said that as soon as everything was ready, Charlene would have to travel north with the gentleman sent by her brother Albert. Having finished reading the letter, Diana looked into her friend's blue eyes and decided that under no circumstances should she be allowed to go north. She decided that, at any cost, she would meet and talk to that Albert. After telling Charlene that she needed to get some fresh air, Diana quickly left the palace. She knew that the novel did not mention that Charlene should go north, and perhaps Diana herself became the culprit, as her actions influenced the course of events. Not finding Albert in the park, she remembered that the gentleman had arrived on horseback and headed towards the stables. Seeing the open door, Diana hoped Albert hadn't gone anywhere, and she might find him there. Then she heard something heavy fall inside and hurried quickly into the stable. Everything went silent inside, and Diana silently looked in. The next second, she saw Duke Albert lying on the floor and his helmet next to him. In her past life, Diana read so many novels that she could easily guess what exactly happened to Duke Albert. Diana was sure that this was poisoning by magic that only exists in the northern lands. 2 years later, an alchemist discovered this unknown disease, which appears only in visitors who have been in the north for a long time. And it is very difficult to identify. Visitors who had been under the influence of the northern lands for a long time became infected with this mana, which in appearance was very similar to a second heart. When the mana is contaminated, all physical processes are interrupted. But while a person is in the north, magic replaces mana and the body functions as usual. Staying in the north provides safety to the person, but if they leave those places, then they must definitely return. But it turned out that all of Diana's efforts regarding Charlene and Andrew did not end with such a happy ending. And now Diana saw that reading about this disease in a novel and seeing how it manifests in reality are completely different things. Leaning over Albert, she understood that it was urgent to solve this problem and imagined how to do it. Diana painstakingly loaded the Duke onto the horse and headed to the alchemist Fernando, whose whereabouts she knew from a past life. She had a rough idea of what this house should look like. There was always a smoking chimney, and the house was painted in bright colors, as if some kind of madness was happening there. Finally, finding the alchemist at home, Diana began to knock incessantly on the door. Fernando opened the door and nervously said that he didn't need to buy newspapers. And indeed, the stranger didn't see the corresponding prohibition on his door. He was so interested in the study of magical poisoning that he personally traveled to the northern lands and finally invented a cure for the disease. Diana replied to the alchemist that she did not sell newspapers, but on the contrary, she had a very important request regarding the northern lands and magic. She added that a hidden disease had been discovered in these lands, and she had strong proof of it. After these words, Diana pointed to the horse and asked the alchemist to look at the man she had brought. Having examined the Duke, Fernando said in surprise that this was an ideal specimen. And immediately changing his attitude towards Diana, he urgently invited her into the house. He carried Albert on his shoulder, brought him into the house, and asked Diana to be careful and not step on his manuscripts. After carefully studying Albert, the alchemist said that this was true northern magic, and he was surprised that the patient's entire body was filled with it. Diana asked Fernando to cure Duke Albert at all costs. The alchemist replied that it would be difficult, although he had researched this disease. But this was only in theory, and he did not have a suitable medicine. Diana replied that she would need ice crystals soaked in the magic of the northern lands. Then she would inject them with holy water, and after heating them over a fire, add them to the patient's body. The alchemist looked at the girl in surprise, and Diana asked him not to ask how she knew this. She knew too many proportions, so she turned to Fernando. The alchemist replied that northern ice is not so easy to melt with ordinary fire. The next second, Diana snapped her fingers, and when a magic flame appeared in her palm. She said that Fernando should not worry about this ingredient. It seemed the alchemist had seen so many things in his life that he was not at all surprised by this magic, and only said that he would immediately start mixing the remaining ingredients. After a while, the first sample was made, and the alchemist said that he had made it in average proportions. Diana took the crystal and asked if there would be any side effects. The alchemist replied that he tested it with the help of a candle flame. The magic does not disappear, but at least it weakens and acts on the patient like a sedative. Diana resolutely approached Albert. All she had to do was summon a flame to melt the crystal. She began to touch the Duke's body, first applying and then removing ice. And suddenly she felt a sensation like small tingling, like an electric shock. Albert's body began to emit a kind of aquamarine glow that gradually filled the entire room. The alchemist looked surprised and said that the reaction was very unexpected and unusual. And Diana said that something was wrong because this mist should dissipate. At some point, the magical power began to be absorbed against her will. And Diana did not understand why this was happening. At some point, the mist became so dense that the girl could no longer distinguish Albert's silhouette. Diana asked herself, horrified, if she had really killed the main character's brother, and that he had disappeared forever. She saw her friend's face before her, full of sadness, and thought about what would happen to Charlene. And Andrew. Now they could send her to prison. The authorities would declare her a murderer, and news about her would appear in newspaper headlines. The next second, Albert's body began to appear, and the alchemist said that he looked too normal for a dead person, and that this should be urgently recorded in the observation book. Diana looked closely and noticed that the Duke's chest was rising and falling, which meant he was breathing. The girl looked at the Duke's face and decided he looked very peaceful. When Albert's breathing stabilized, Diana sighed with relief. Fernando wrote in the book that fire could partially cleanse the patient's body of magic. And then he said that when Albert wakes up, it is necessary to ask him about everything. The flame did not burn for long and began to go out, and the acrid smoke and black ice gradually disappeared completely. Diana sat beside him and thought how sweetly Albert slept, but a minute ago he could have died. When she was convinced that the Duke was cured, she told the alchemist that she urgently needed to return to the palace because she said she had gone out to get some fresh air, and that they were probably worried there. But before Diana had time to move away from Albert, he suddenly took her hand, which greatly frightened the girl. Albert opened his eyes and said that he now felt the warmth of Diana's hand. At first he thought he had done it in a dream, but when he saw the Duke's eyes open, he asked if he could see her. Albert looked silently at Diana, and she thought this wouldn't end today. Diana slowly, finger by finger, released her hand and hurried to leave because she could get lost. She quickly wrote him a letter for him to read when he fully woke up, about how he ended up here and about his magical poisoning illness. Now Diana had no time to think about the Duke. She needed to solve two important problems. She understood that the ceremony was already over, and the first thing she had to do was listen to the sermons of her relatives, who were worried about her. The second was to somehow calm my brother down. As the novel's title suggests, there are recurring fantasy elements throughout the novel, one of which is a special ability possessed by the protagonist's family members. Apparently, at that moment, Andrew experienced those feelings that unconsciously forced him to use this gift. The maid ran after Diana and shouted that the second part of the house was also on fire. This gift was passed down from generation to generation, and direct descendants of the Valerian family could control fire. Thanks to this ability, all members of the clan had red hair and eyes. Andrew also had this gift, but he didn't control it due to his explosive nature and temperament. Diana shouted at her brother to stop setting everything on fire, or he calmed down, or he wouldn't leave the room. She added that alcohol wouldn't solve the problem and wouldn't affect his relationship with Charlene. Diana advised her brother to stop setting everything on fire and calm down, and tomorrow she would visit Charlene and decide everything regarding his engagement. Andrew looked at his sister and started to calm down, then asked them to do it together. Albert felt a sharp cold and thought that this was his punishment for taking other people's lives. He really wanted to see Charlene because they had been separated from his sister for a long time. Albert remembered that once, his sister sent him a portrait of Diana, who was looking at him from the canvas. As if she knew everything in advance. The letter received along with the portrait also mentioned Diana's brother, Andrew, about whom Charlene wrote with special warmth. Albert wanted to do a lot for his sister Charlene, but he wouldn't want her to have the life he lives. At that moment, he was in the fog. Albert didn't understand where these thoughts came from and what was happening around him. The next second, he felt the warmth of touch and heard a voice, as if he had already reached heaven. That said the Duke was sleeping very sweetly, and this evoked a feeling of calm in him. He still couldn't make out this luminous silhouette, but he felt sadness in those moments when this color moved away. Albert wanted to grab that something so as not to feel annoyed by its distance. Finally, he barely opened his eyes and looking around, saw a room he didn't know. He sat on the floor and saw nowhere the silhouette he had seen in his dream, and from which so much warmth came. At that moment, Fernando approached him and began to ask the Duke what was happening. Maybe he was hot or cold. How long he had had these symptoms, and how long he had been in the north. Albert instantly grabbed the alchemist by the neck and asked what this place was, and who he was. Eagerly awaiting the next morning, Diana went to Fernando's house to visit Albert. Upon opening the door, Diana saw an alchemist collecting manuscripts and some evidence from the floor, and asked what had happened here. Fernando replied that thank God everything was fine, but as soon as the Duke woke up, he almost destroyed his entire laboratory. The alchemist added that the letter written by Diana helped him come to his senses. And before leaving, he asked Fernando to make a magical object. After making sure everything was fine with the Duke, Diana returned home, because she and her brother planned to visit Charlene at Raphael Ui's house. Approaching the estate gates, Diana wondered if she could ask Charlene where the gentleman she saw yesterday was. While walking through the garden, she thought about why they didn't plant flowers on the lawn here. As if time had stopped in the house after Albert left. When Diana and Andrew approached the house, the brother said he was very worried, and that perhaps it would be better if they talked outside. The sister replied that behind the house there was a wonderful greenhouse, and that it would be perfect to carry out this conversation, creating a cozy atmosphere. She added that she would be waiting for them in the greenhouse and advised her brother that on the way there, he should have informal conversations with Charlene about abstract topics. Andrew thanked Diana for her advice and said he was very happy to have such an intelligent sister. Finding the greenhouse was not difficult for Diana because she and Charlene spent a lot of time there together. She knew that her friend still diligently took care of the flowers that Charlene's parents had planted. And then Diana heard a strange metallic sound. She cautiously turned around and saw Duke Albert, who was in the same garden. She grasped the Duke's mood and thought that it was all due to his illness, which did not give him the opportunity to take his sister to the north. And then Diana noticed that Albert's eyes had become completely different, unlike what they were before. The girl suggested that perhaps the Duke received magical lenses from Fernando and greeted him politely. The Duke returned the greeting and told her that he still didn't feel quite well. He then added that while he was with the alchemist Fernando, he heard something from him. At first he thanked Diana for caring so much about his sister, but the girl saw some kind of threat in his eyes. Then the Duke added with a serious look that if Diana had told a lie, he would never forgive her. Diana tried to pretend she didn't notice this, but only replied politely that they didn't understand what they were talking about. The next moment, the girl did not expect Albert to take her hand. Diana felt such a strong chill that it was impossible for her to bear it. She said that someone might see them, and the Duke replied that it turned out it was not a lie. Diana said that apart from Charlene, she had no connection with this person, so she had no intention of harming anyone. To which the Duke replied that Diana didn't even ask who his sister was, and why the gentleman spoke to her first. For a moment, Diana thought he was just testing her and didn't know what to answer him at that moment. Albert continued, and told Diana that he himself was going to tell her everything. He then added that in the near future she would have to see him often, just like his sister. So it was better to tell her everything right away. The Duke fell silent for a while, and then asked if she could expect this conversation to remain secret between them. Diana remembered that she was a very close friend of Charlene, and therefore, no one would find out about their conversation. She then asked why the Duke said they would see each other often, but he replied that, according to the alchemist, he constantly needed to recharge his energy. He took out magical crystals and explained that this had to be done before the symptoms of the disease appeared. Diana understood why, when the Duke took her hand, the same glow and the same sensation of causticity appeared on his body. She replied to the Duke that there was no need to meet her, because she could melt the crystal in any fire. Albert replied that, according to the alchemist, no other fire could produce the desired effect like Diana's magical fire. Diana was surprised that during her absence, the alchemist Fernando could achieve such results. And now he knows almost everything about this disease and how to get rid of it, or at least reduce its influence. A minute later, Charlene appeared in the distance with Andrew. She wanted to shout to her brother, but immediately corrected herself and called the gentleman Sir Diego. When they approached, Diana saw her brother's dissatisfied look, who asked Charlene, pointing to the gentleman, who he was. Diana remembered that they were strangers, introduced her brother as Nathan Diego, who came from the north. She added that this man would stay here for about a month and accompany her everywhere, and then invited everyone for tea. When everyone sat at the table in the center of the greenhouse, Charlene said she would bring dessert. That Sir Diego would probably like. Andrew looked at the gentleman and said that he came from the north, and perhaps he was seeing Charlene for the first time. But for some reason, it seemed to him that they were quite close. Albert replied that, unlike some, he gets along very well with people and quickly finds common ground. Diana looked at both men and couldn't help but notice the way they looked at each other. Albert said that Andrew was acting childishly, just because Charlene was paying more attention to him. And then a brilliant idea struck Diana. She will invite them to make peace and shake hands. At that moment, Albert will be able to recharge with her magical energy, and after one, they will make peace. The next second, she imagined that everything had happened successfully. They shook hands, made peace, and said out loud that he would entrust a matter to his brother. Finally, Charlene appeared and brought a table with all sorts of sweets and desserts. Even a blind person would notice that she was paying too much attention to the gentleman, offering him to try one dish and then another. But when Charlene said she would be happy if the Duke's tastes hadn't changed, it immediately became clear to everyone that they knew each other. If the servants had seen them at that moment, they might have misunderstood this situation. Especially Andrew. And then Diana realized that she needed to intervene in the situation to distract everyone from what was happening. She turned to Charlene and said she wanted to ask her for forgiveness. This helped her distract Charlene from the Duke. And continued, remember her friend the day she managed to disappear for a while, and Charlene was very worried. The friend replied that she was very worried about Diana, but when she sent her a note, Charlene calmed down. She added that the note said Diana was feeling a little unwell, and she was glad to feel better the next day. Diana apologized once again to her friend and told her that she had written a lie in the letter, and that she had lied to her. And when Charlene asked what really happened, Diana was silent for a second, thinking about how to get out of this situation. Diana caught Albert's gaze, who was asking with his whole appearance not to talk about what really happened. Diana tried to smile innocently and said that that evening, she ran after Sir Diego. Charlene looked at her friend in surprise and asked her for what purpose she was doing this. Diana said she wanted to talk to the gentleman about not taking Charlene with him to the north. As his brother asked, Charlene smiled and replied that she never expected such an act from her friend. Diana added that the Duke was delighted with the girl's friendship and agreed not to take Charlene north. She looked at Albert and added that the gentleman had promised to talk to his brother to accept this proposal. Charlene looked at her brother and asked if the gentleman really responded like that. Albert looked at Diana and she was very frightened by his gaze. She even felt like he was about to attack her like a wild animal. But then the Duke turned to his sister and told her that this is exactly how he responded to Diana. He added that he would convey everything to Charlene's brother. He then added that he would stay here for a month to observe how the lady was doing. And he would convey everything to the Duke. Diana couldn't find any more words than to say she was happy to see him. And Charlene added that Diego would recognize them when he had been living here for a month. And there was no person in the world who treated her better than Andrew. Diana looked at her brother and didn't understand why he looked so downcast. Charlene also paid attention to Andrew's behavior because he should be happy, and not the other way around. Finally, Andrew turned to Diana and asked her why she didn't know anything about Charlene being taken north. Then Diana realized that, by trying to hide one secret, she had accidentally revealed another. Because no one wanted Andrew to know that Charlene had to leave. He then turned to Charlene and told her that if Diana hadn't let it slip, he would never have known anything about it. Charlene looked at Andrew with guilty eyes and didn't know what to answer him, feeling guilty. Without waiting for an answer from either Charlene or Diana, Andrew got up, apologized, and headed for the exit. Charlene jumped off the table and shouted that she and Andrew needed to talk. Diana also stood up and said that perhaps it would be better if she talked to Andrew, because she knew her brother better. But Charlene said it would be more correct and better if she explained everything herself. Diana tried to find a reason to leave, saying that she remembered having a very important matter. And then, Albert said that he was still tormented by the words Diana said at the table. Diana feared that Albert would now start interrogating her about how she knew about his illness. She asked if he meant energy when he said he would entrust an important matter to his brother. Without waiting for an answer, Albert added that if this is the case, then Diana should abandon this idea, because he is categorically against it. Andrew is not pleasing enough for him to let anyone touch him, and the idea makes him shudder. Albert then added that the most important thing is that he doesn't like anyone knowing about his weakness. Diana replied that then, probably, the Duke would not be entirely comfortable, because she was Andrew's sister, and suggested looking for another person who controlled fire. Albert said that this was categorically ruled out because as few people as possible should know about it, and he couldn't trust anyone who might act in their own interest. Diana realized that she had no other choice and replied that the Duke could trust her, and that she would try to take care of him. Hearing these words, Albert involuntarily smiled and said he looked forward to seeing her again. Realizing this, Diana didn't understand whether he smiled sincerely or if it was just mockery. The next day, while Diana was still sleeping, the servants were busy on the estate. They talked about how everything should be ready in advance and before the lady called them. One of the servants said how they could wear such heavy suits, and the second replied that, in any case, their mistress would be the most beautiful at the ball. Upon leaving for the hallway, Diana overheard their conversation and asked what ball they were talking about. They replied that they had recently brought an invitation to a ball dedicated to Her Majesty's birthday, and that the servants were doing everything possible to make their mistress the most beautiful one there. Hearing this, Diana was very surprised. She knew nothing about the princess's birthday. One of the servants said that this was a very important ball before the princess came of age, so invitations were sent to all the aristocrats. Diana thought about it, because lately she had been so busy with the two main characters that she hadn't attended any ball, ceremony, or other parties and teas. Diana really didn't want to go to this event, but still decided to return to the room to read the invitation. She rummaged through the pile of letters until she found the envelope she needed from Deborah Francis. The imperial Princess Bastia was the sole heir to the throne. She disliked Albert, and she hated Charlene, often mocking her. Deborah was the main villain of this novel. It all started with Raffaello's ex-spouses, whose lives suddenly began to change. The emperor intended to marry his daughter to Albert to annex the duchy of Raffaello. But almost 4 years passed, and Albert was 19 years old, but he was still against marrying the princess. The emperor ran out of patience and offered Albert two options to choose from. He had to marry Deborah or move to the north. If he had chosen the first, then his sister Charlene would have become a duchess from childhood. And she would have known all the aristocratic filth with all its unaesthetic details. Therefore, he chose the second option and, without hesitation, left for the north. But Deborah was still dissatisfied with this, because for so many years she had endured the rejections of a man whom she didn't even love. Diana woke up when the servants threw open the curtains, and the room flooded with bright sunlight. When the servant asked if the lady had found what she was looking for, Diana replied that she had read the letter and she was going to the imperial palace with Charlene for the ball, which would take place in 4 days. The servants were worried because there was very little time for preparation. And Diana said that probably all the most beautiful dresses had already been sold out, and that she would have to go with what she had. The maid replied that wouldn't work, that she needed to contact Charlene, who had probably prepared several outfits and could lend her one of the dresses. The maid took Diana by the hand and, going out onto the street, said the carriage was ready, and that they needed to leave immediately for the Raffaello estate. When Diana entered the large, spacious, and bright main hall, she was informed that the lady was trying on outfits, and that Lady Diana could approach her. Charlene's dressing room looked like one of those expensive shops located in the center of the capital. There were many jewels, expensive shoes, and beautiful outfits. And suddenly Diana saw Albert, but what could he be doing here? Because he was posing as a gentleman. She politely greeted the Duke and decided that he must have come here to fulfill some request from Charlene. But then Charlene was informed that Lady Diana had arrived. Charlene came out of the fitting room and told her friend that it was very good that she had come, because Charlene had chosen a beautiful dress but couldn't find accessories to match it. She complained to Diana that the maids were trying hard, but their advice and opinions differed and therefore it was very difficult to choose. Charlene added that Diana has excellent taste, and perhaps she would help her choose the jewelry. The next moment, Charlene turned to Albert and asked if he could also help with the selection, because the more people involved, the better. Albert replied that if Charlene is willing to listen to his opinion, she can try on the jewels he has right in front of him. At the same time, Diana pointed to the same jewels and, at the same time as Albert, said that she had chosen a suitable necklace for Charlene. The moment Diana's and Albert's hands touched, she felt that the Duke was still cold, but not as much as before. Albert took Diana's hand, and she tried to tell him she was cold and asked him to let go. The Duke only moved his lips imperceptibly, but Diana could read from them that he did not want to let her go. Diana understood why he was holding her hand, because due to his illness, he wanted to feel warmth. Still, this situation was dangerous because others might misinterpret them. Indeed, Charlene saw it and at first seemed very surprised. But her thoughts immediately dissipated the moment Diana said that she and the gentleman had chosen the same jewels for her, which means she should wear them. Diana thought she needed to stay a little away from the Duke and decided to step aside. But suddenly she heard the voice of her maid Daisy, who turned to Charlene. The servants, almost crying, turned to Charlene and asked her to scold her mistress Diana. Daisy tried to explain her displeasure, because Diana wanted to wear one of her existing dresses for the ball at the imperial palace, simply modifying it, but she couldn't do it. Charlene replied that she didn't know Diana was also going to this ball. Otherwise, she would have invited her to choose outfits together. Diana couldn't hear their conversation, but seeing Charlene and the servants whispering, she asked what they were doing. The next moment, a beautiful shimmering dress appeared in front of Diana, and Charlene said that her friend should definitely try it on. Charlene turned to Daisy and asked if she agreed with her opinion, to which she replied that this dress would look great on the lady. Charlene turned to Albert and asked if he agreed with her choice. The Duke replied that, looking only at the dress, he couldn't say anything. And then he approached the maid. He took the suit from her and headed towards Diana. He pressed the dress against her body, and it seemed to Diana that he was so close that she even felt his breath. Diana felt so uncomfortable in front of everyone that the only thing she could say was that this dress didn't suit her. And nobody around, except Diana, heard Albert whisper to her that in a month he would approach her and touch her more often. He then added quietly that no matter how much Diana tried, she couldn't run away from him all the time. He then turned to Charlene and said that he thought the dress suited Diana very well. Diana wanted to run, but Charlene convinced her to try on the rest of the attire and, dragging her behind the curtain, she began to take out shoes and jewelry. Taking advantage of the moment, Charlene asked Diana what mood Andrew was in yesterday. And Diana replied that her brother was in a good mood. He was smiling all the time. Seeing the smile on Charlene's face, Diana was glad she could calm her friend. When she came out of the fitting room in the chosen dress, the Duke said that this outfit suited her very well. Finally, after an hour of tedious dressing, Diana managed to escape from her friend. Albert took the suitcase with the jewelry from her hands to help her get into the carriage. He then asked Diana if her brother had always been like that, got angry, and then calmed down. She realized that he had overheard their conversation in the fitting room and said that it was not good to eavesdrop. But the Duke replied that he simply had good hearing. Then Albert looked at Diana and said that Charlene was a weak and timid girl when she was a child, and that she always wanted a strong and reliable man close by. The Duke added that once, before the debutante ball, a whole line of gentlemen lined up next to her, and they wanted to become her partner. Diana thought he would never defend Andrew and replied that her brother was also considered attractive. At that moment, Daisy shouted that all her things were packed and they could leave. Diana took the suitcase from Albert's hands and got into the carriage. But the next second, she felt the Duke's cold hand touch her hair. Albert placed his hand on her shoulder and said that, in terms of appearance, she could easily beat her brother. He turned Diana towards him and added that his sister was the most beautiful lady in the empire. Diana was lost, but the Duke let her go and told her to be careful on the way. She took care of the Duke and decided that he had gone mad and that there wasn't a drop of blood in his body. Albert turned around and said that he had not lied about the dress, and that this outfit really suited his lady very well. Sitting in the carriage, Daisy said that she saw how the gentleman looked at the lady and that perhaps he liked her. Diana laughed and replied that it was nothing of the sort. They were just Charlene's friends, so the gentleman tried to behave courteously. She added that the gentleman came from the north following Duke Raffaello's direction and, of course, he would treat everyone surrounding Charlene with full attention. When Albert returned to the house, Charlene asked if her brother had spoken to Diana about anything special. He replied that there was nothing strange. He just loaded things into the carriage, and that was it. Albert added that if he made a mistake in his behavior, he asked for forgiveness. And Charlene replied that maybe she just imagined it when she looked out the window. At that moment, a servant entered the room and said that Lady Charlene was waiting in the dressing room. Leaving the garden, Albert thought that Diana was avoiding him, fearing his presence, and seemed to be looking for a place to hide with her eyes. For the first time in his life, he congratulated a stranger, and Diana stepped back frightened. And as soon as he started thinking about Diana, previously unknown feelings appeared inside him. Albert ran through different options in his head to set a trap for Diana and meet her again. He wanted to take the girl's hand and hold it as long as possible without letting go. For a moment he imagined how all this happened, and then, suddenly, he was surprised, thinking that from the outside it looked very stupid. And he smiled. Finally, the day of the imperial ball arrived, and Diana's mother warned her daughter that if she spent the night away from home again, she would be very angry. The father, knowing Andrew's character, told his son to behave with dignity and to remember that he was the heir to the family. He then asked if Andrew had changed his mind after his engagement to Lady Raffaello. Andrew replied that his wish remained valid, and his father said that in this case, he should only show his good side. Mom said they would go first, and that they could pick up Charlene and come later. Sitting in the carriage, Diana looked at her brother and thought that, although his engagement to Charlene ended happily, the newspapers caused a scandal. The fact that the heroes of the celebration did not show up before the guests all evening did not go unnoticed, and in the end Charlene appeared tearful. After this, rumors spread that his daughter-in-law was forced to work. The carriage arrived at the porch of the Raffaello estate, and Diana told her brother to go get Charlene, and that she would wait in the carriage. After a while, Diana began to worry because neither Andrew nor Charlene were there. She was getting bored because if Andrew and Charlene were on a date, she would have to sit and wait in the carriage. Diana felt stuffy. At first, she decided to go out for some fresh air, but then changed her mind because her hair would get ruined. And then, suddenly, someone knocked on the carriage door, and Diana, startled, opened the curtain. Diana saw Duke Albert and wondered if he was also going to the ball. He opened the door and asked permission to sit in the carriage for a while. Feeling his cold breath and seeing his sickly look, Diana decided he felt very unwell. Breathing heavily, Albert said his health was on the verge and asked if Diana had seen an alchemist lately. She replied that she hadn't seen him because for the last few days she had been preparing for the imperial ball. The Duke realized that Diana didn't have any crystals and staggered from helplessness. Diana became worried and said that she urgently needed to find a person who would go to the alchemist for crystals. Albert replied that he had the last crystal and it was in the inner pocket of his jacket. But he couldn't get it by himself and asked Diana to do it. The girl initially hesitated, but then realized she had no other choice. And that, in any case, she had to touch the Duke. She was so close that Diana felt his cold breath again. Finally, she took out the crystal, placed it in Albert's hand, and asked him if it was difficult for him to touch her hand. The Duke replied that, on the contrary, he felt warm and did not want to let go of Diana's hand. Albert looked at the girl, and she reminded him that someone needed to deliver the crystals to him by visiting the alchemist. Andrew and Charlene approached the carriage and said that the gentleman was almost like a brother to her, and that they would definitely find common ground with Andrew. Seeing them, the Duke put his finger to his lips and, looking at Diana, asked her with his eyes to remain silent. And the moment Andrew approached the carriage door, Albert abruptly opened it. Andrew grabbed the cheek where the blow landed and, thinking it was Diana, said that his sister was very careless. Then he saw a gentleman who told Diana that he hadn't noticed her brother. Apparently, he was a very discreet person. Andrew was outraged by how the Duke could call him a discreet person and tried to attack him without restraining his emotions. And then Charlene intervened, saying that if the four of them went to the ball, then they had to get rid of the hostility. Albert replied that he would go to the ball on his horse, but Charlene convinced him that the four of them should go in one carriage. Charlene chirped the whole time and said she was very happy that she and Diana were finally going out together. The men, on the contrary, sat with their faces turned away from each other, each looking out their own window. In such a tense situation, the journey to the imperial palace seemed very long to the four of them. Finally, when everyone got out of the carriage, Charlene expressed her wish to enter the palace with the gentleman. Albert replied that this was not allowed if she entered accompanied by another man. Unpleasant rumors would spread. The Duke added that he and Lady Valerian would enter separately and offered her his hand. Diana replied that she accepted his proposal, and she and the Duke headed to the palace. The imperial palace shone in all its splendor, as it should be. Diana thought that she had finally gotten out of this uncomfortable carriage, but the situation was no better here. As soon as the four of them were in the hallway, Diana heard whispers that the young people had quarreled right at the engagement. Some commented that Lady Charlene had to wipe away tears because of her mother-in-law's strict morals, while others said that the era of the Valerian family was over. Diana decided that if the four of them crowded together like this, they would attract even more negative attention and, therefore, they needed to separate. Andrew gallantly offered his hand to Charlene and asked if she would like to dance the first dance with him. Charlene smiled at him and replied that she would be delighted to do so. Hearing this, Andrew looked at the Duke with a victorious look and smiled imperceptibly. Diana noticed this and decided that Andrew was behaving like a child if he wanted to annoy the Duke with such a stupid prank. And then she turned around and saw Duke Albert leaving and called out to him. Albert turned around, and she asked him if the gentleman was going to leave his companion alone. The Duke replied that it was unlikely anything would happen if he was absent for a short time. Diana replied that the Duke underestimated the aristocrats and that rumors could spread about couples who attended the ball together. Albert replied that, in that case, he was willing to make efforts to ensure that there were no rumors about Lady Diana. He then added that, if you dance at least one dance with your partner, it definitely won't generate rumors. Diana looked at Albert and wanted to understand what was hidden in those gray eyes. Judging by the way he treats his sister, the Duke definitely also has some feelings. But Diana couldn't understand one thing: why does he repress these feelings for himself? Considering them his weak point. Seeing her look, the Duke said that Diana looked at him like a poor little puppy. Diana replied that she would look at the puppy completely differently, and Albert did not look so charming. And then an order was heard throughout the palace for everyone to bow their heads. The butler announced His Majesty, the Emperor and Princess Deborah Francis. This was the main villain of the novel, whom in the book they called the Trench of the Future. Her words were sharper than daggers, but she still remained the direct heir of I. And she received special abilities from the imperial family. They said that the first emperor knew how to control people, but generations passed, and this ability weakened. But Deborah was born, who fully possessed this power, and then the butler announced the arrival of Elvis Francis. This was Deborah's half-brother, although he did not have any outstanding abilities. But everyone praised him. The emperor looked towards the hall and told his daughter that he was very happy that so many guests had come to congratulate her on coming of age. After the congratulatory speeches, the princess was immediately surrounded by representatives of aristocratic families. At the same time, there was almost no one around the prince. Apparently the guests were afraid of angering the princess. Charlene looked at Deborah, whom it was impossible to approach, and hoped she had invited her to make peace. She invited Diana to approach the princess and also greet her, but the girl replied that she needed to wait until there were fewer people. The next minute, the girls saw Albert and Andrew fighting again over something, and they hurried to separate them as quickly as possible. When the men finally calmed down, Charlene heard footsteps behind her, and she turned around. It was Prince Elvis. He greeted the Duchess and said that they used to see each other at balls until the Duke left for the north. And almost 4 years had passed since that moment. Elvis congratulated Charlene on her engagement and said he found out from the newspapers. Then he looked at Andrew and asked if this man was her fiancé. Elvis recognized him. He was the eldest son of Marquis Valerian. He extended his hand to Andrew and told him that he had heard a lot about him and about his work for the Empire in those places where help was needed. Diana watched the conversation from the sidelines and thought that although Elvis seemed simple, he is still a prince. Elvis noticed her gaze and turned to greet and salute the Duchess. The prince noticed Albert and, extending his hand, asked Diana who the gentleman next to her was. But the Duke timely withdrew his cold hand and said he was very happy to meet His Majesty. He gallantly brought his hand to his chest and, bowing, said his name was Diego. Diana fears that Prince Elvis recognizes Albert and tells him that Sir Diego has come to the ball with her as a companion. To distract the prince's attention, she pretended to be a lady who wanted to draw his attention to herself. Diana added that, in her opinion, the banquet at the imperial palace was organized at a high level. Everything was very dignified and beautiful. But Elvis seemed to recognize Albert and told Diana that he was very happy to meet her partner. Then the prince looked at Diana and said that, as she had already noticed, he arrived at the ball alone. And now Elvis is simply looking for a companion who can accompany him tonight. If it weren't for Sir Diego, Elvis would have asked Lady Valerian to be his companion for today. Diana replied that if she had known in advance, she would have come to the ball alone. The next second, Albert took Diana's hand and asked her if she was going to leave him alone. Realizing this, Elvis said that Sir Diego seemed to like Lady Valerian. The prince looked at Albert. He said he was not going to take his partner away and got lost among the guests, wishing to have a good time. Andrew told Diego that there was an immediate difference in the prince's voice when he spoke to him. And then Charlene, seeing her brother holding Diana's hand, was very surprised by this. Diana felt noticeably embarrassed and pulled her hand away, and Albert politely apologized. Charlene said that the gentleman probably had good reasons for this, because he was not the type of person to simply take a lady's hand. The Duke replied that he had to hold Lady Diana's hand, otherwise the prince would not have left just like that. To get out of this awkward situation, Diana wanted to say she needed to go to the bathroom. But she accidentally tripped over the hem of her dress and almost fell into Albert's arms. The Duke quietly asked if Diana really intended to go with Prince Elvis. Diana didn't have time to answer the Duke, as she noticed that the next second all the guests around her parted. Her Majesty Princess Deborah, surrounded by her entourage, was approaching them. She arrogantly looked at Charlene and Andrew and said she heard they broke off their engagement. But they came to the ball together. Apparently they value each other highly. Andrew replied that it was just stupid rumors and that they did not break off their engagement. Deborah told him to shut up because she wasn't talking to him at the moment. The princess told Charlene that she had met Duke Albert when she was a child and considered him a real scoundrel. Charlene looked at Deborah and realized that reconciliation was out of the question. The princess added that Albert had behaved very insolently towards the emperor, that he had good intentions, and she hoped that the Duke would do well in the north. Charlene felt the mockery in her voice, but could not say anything against her. Deborah continued that nothing had been heard of the Duke for some time. But then rumors spread that they called him a monster. Charlene knew she had to endure. Otherwise, the purpose of the visit to the ball would be doomed to failure. And maybe she would never see her brother if Deborah snapped her fingers. Indeed, during Albert's absence, the position of the Raffaello family was greatly affected. The princess looked at Charlene and said that if she had anything to answer, then she could try to talk. Charlene said that she perfectly understood the princess's anger and hatred towards the Duke, because Albert had rejected her proposal to marry him so many times. Diana looked at Charlene and realized that the true Raffaello, although kind, could easily accept a challenge. Charlene asked Deborah not to be angry with her brother. The princess simply wasn't his type. The next second, Charlene violated the princess's boundaries and approaching her. She said she wanted to tell her something in a whisper. She whispered that it seemed Deborah was sampling sweets because she had remnants of dessert stuck to her teeth. Charlene advised her to wipe it off before others noticed, and added that if the princess looked at her brother's face for so long, her mood might deteriorate. The girl added that she was not going to ruin her vacation because today the princess was the main protagonist and probably wouldn't stay long at the ball. With these words, Charlene turned away proudly and headed towards the palace exit. Deborah's face showed open hatred and anger as she watched Charlene leave. Diana was glad that the Duke behaved with dignity and did not argue with the princess, defending his sister, but she looked worriedly at the exit through which Charlene left the palace. From Albert's look, Diana understood that he was ready to break and throw everything away because of the words spoken by the princess. But since he had to remain silent, he was apparently offended. Diana told the Duke to follow his sister and that she would probably go too, because all her thoughts were on Charlene and her recent conversation with Deborah. She headed down the hall and didn't even look at her brother or Albert. Diana had her own reasons to stay at the ball and not follow them. She had to calm Deborah, who was crying and upset about her conversation with Charlene. Diana could have asked the princess why she should cry over something so small. But her behavior could be the turning point. Initially, Deborah harassed Charlene due to her resentment towards Albert. But after today's incident, it is possible that she herself will come to hate Charlene. Diana feared that this Cold War could affect her too, but she was not going to betray Charlene. And at least someone had to leave Deborah a good impression of himself today. The princess saw Diana and said she knew that she was Charlene's best friend. And perhaps she had come to fix things with her. Now Deborah looked like a small child, raised in greenhouse conditions. Diana replied to the princess that she was not going to do this, she just wanted to relax. But all the places were occupied by other ladies. She sat down next to her and added that she just wanted to relax in the viewing area, but by chance saw Deborah here. And then Diana started taking off her shoes, saying her feet were very tired. She told the princess that she could do the same there, because nobody could see them here. Deborah replied, surprised how she could take off her shoes, how Diana could suggest this to her. Or she had no idea. Diana replied that she considered the princess's words a compliment because she never gets angry. Even if she makes some mistakes or something doesn't work out, she still doesn't despair. Deborah looked at her interlocutor in surprise and said she was truly shameless. Diana replied that until recently she had pain in her chest, but now, after talking with the princess, she felt much better. She even felt like laughing. She then added that she only had one older brother, and if she had a younger sister, Diana would treat her exactly like a princess. Deborah looked at the girl and said she had never met people who treated her the way she did. With these words, the princess got up and said she needed to go to the guests, and that she was probably lost by now. Diana told her afterwards that the princess should enjoy today's vacation and not listen to anyone, pay attention to no one, and behave confidently. After all, the coming-of-age day happens once in a lifetime, and the princess is entitled to it. Diana let out a sigh of relief when she returned home in the evening. Diana lay down on the bed and thought that she should wash up, but if she called the maid Daisy, she would give her nightly treatments, and Diana was very tired. She thought about Princess Deborah and hoped she would return from her guests in a good mood. The book describes how the princess was ashamed of fleeing and then regretted it. And then she heard strange sounds, like knocking on a window. At first, Diana thought it was some animal or bird, but the windows were on the second floor. And the knocks were rhythmic and intensified with every hit. The girl thought it might be a ghost, and grabbing a candelabra, cautiously approached the window. Diana lit the candles and began to wave them, trying to scare the ghost away from her bedroom windows. Then she gathered her courage and looked out the window, and, surprised, could not utter a word. It was Albert. He was clinging to the balcony railing and asked if he had scared Lady Diana. The girl opened the balcony doors and, approaching him, told him that naturally. She was scared and then asked him how he got here, because it was very high up. The Duke replied that it wasn't difficult for him, although he broke his spells, and that Lady Diana would need to reinforce her security. In every generation of Raffaello, a sword master appeared who could split mountains and seize with his skills, and this time it was Albert. Diana asked if the Duke managed to talk to Charlene. Albert replied that there was no time for that, because Diana's brother quickly took the girl to the room. He then added that Charlene didn't want to talk to anyone today and asked not to bother her. From Albert's look, Diana thought he felt guilty because he couldn't stay with his sister today. She told the Duke that he shouldn't think about it, because at that moment he did the right thing. He made the right decision. Thanks to his patient behavior at the ball, his sister Charlene remained safe. Diana thanked the Duke for his patience and said that Charlene probably thought the same. The next moment, Albert got so close that Diana got a little scared. She tried to find a reason for the Duke's behavior and thought that she probably said something wrong. Albert turned his back to Diana and, placing his hands on her shoulders, reminded her of his request that she not run away from him. And then Diana felt his soft hands touching her shoulders and began to move more and more along her body. A moment later, Diana felt the Duke's body over her back, and a shiver ran through her whole body. She turned to Albert embarrassed and asked why he had come there. He replied that he was simply worried whether Lady Diana had arrived home safely. Then, the Duke added that he had been waiting for her for almost an hour and regretted not being able to see her off. Diana noticed that Albert began to move a little further away from her. Apparently, he noticed that the girl was embarrassed and frightened. The Duke replied that he had not told Lady Diana the most important thing. Diana replied that if Albert meant his illness, then we must agree on all the details in advance. It will be more convenient. Then the girl reminded the Duke that she had asked Ferdinand to get her information about magical poisoning, and that she would probably have to visit the alchemist in the near future. Albert asked when Diana was planning the trip because he also wanted to go with her. The girl replied that she was going tomorrow, after spending some time with her friend. because she always visits Charlene after something happens to her. The Duke thought for a moment and replied that, in this case, Lady Diana could not go unnoticed. The girl replied that she would ask her brother to pay more attention to Charlene, and so Diana could leave peacefully. Albert looked closely at the girl and said that, when he referred to brother, he meant Andrew Valerian. When Diana replied that she actually meant her brother Andrew, she noticed how Albert's face changed. For he was obsessed with his sister Charlene. The Duke added that he hopes Andrew is a serious and responsible person in whom his sister Charlene can be trusted. Diana thought this might be a test for her brother and decided to quickly send Albert home and teach Andrew good manners and how to behave. She advised the Duke to be careful and hurried to say goodbye to him. Albert asked why Lady Diana wanted to say goodbye so quickly, and she replied that they had discussed everything and that it was already late. Diana replied that she was simply worried about Albert because it was very dangerous to walk in the dark. The Duke replied that before leaving, he would like to hear the answer to the question he asked Lady Diana at the ball. Diana said that the Duke seemed to be referring to Prince Elvis. She added that she doesn't remember the details of that situation well, as she was very worried at the time that the Duke would be exposed. Albert replied that, in that case, the lady should not worry about the memories of that night. The Duke added that they would see each other tomorrow, and, smiling slightly, headed towards the terrace. Diana noticed his smile, and, standing on the balcony, wondered if he had really come in the middle of the night just to ask her about this. Elvis was on the roof of the palace and thoughtfully looked at the night sky. A minute later, he called his servant Cadden and told him that he was ready to carry out any of his instructions. The prince, without turning around, ordered the servant to get all the information about a person. And his name is Nathan Diego. Elvis remembered the ball that ended a couple of hours ago and thought it was an ordinary event and boring until he met a bright, red-haired girl. Her behavior was noticeably different from other ladies, and no matter how tenderly he looked at her, she did not react. During the conversation, although the girl behaved directly, she realized that she seemed a bit cunning. At that moment, when Diana's companion took her hand, Elvis thought he looked a lot like Albert Raffaello, whom the emperor wanted to marry his daughter to. On the other hand, maybe it's not him, but just a guest who looks like him. But Sir Diego's gaze was exactly the same as Duke Albert's. If it's not the Duke, then it's a great relief for Elvis, but if it is him, it will be an advantage for him anyway. The next morning in the Valerian family, as usual, began with a joint breakfast. The mother exclaimed that lately she has been learning to arrange bouquets. That helps her put her body in order. And her mind. Smiling, she turned to her husband and asked if perhaps he would also like to try this activity. The father stroked her cheek and told her that she didn't need to do this because he already had a beautiful flower. Diana looked at her parents and wondered if she would really be like her mother, who would also tenderly take her future husband's hand. She will also smile and laugh at his jokes. Then she will raise her head and look tenderly into his gray eyes. Diana suddenly blushed and couldn't understand why she was introducing the Duke now. She instantly jumped up and grabbed her head. It seemed to her that she was losing her mind or going crazy. And then she noticed with what surprise and concern those around her were looking at her. Trying to justify herself somehow, Diana said she felt strange, maybe because of her parents' conversation, or because her brother Andrew had met Charlene. The mother looked at her daughter and told her that perhaps her behavior was due to loneliness, because she wasn't dating anyone. Diana tried to object, saying she wasn't alone, but that her mood had just changed for a moment. Her father said that this feeling of loneliness would definitely disappear as soon as she met a real man, but only one like him. Diana replied that she would listen to her father's advice only to get away from this topic. A minute later, the parents had already forgot about their daughter's mood and, standing in their arms, they congratulated each other. Today Diana had 2 planned meetings, so after breakfast she took an umbrella. And she was about to leave home, but Andrew caught up with her. The brother asked if his sister was going to see Charlene, but she replied that she had completely different plans. When Andrew asked her to tell him where she was going and if he could go with her. Diana sharply replied that she was not obliged to inform him about her personal affairs. First, she decided to see the alchemist, and after meeting Fernando, see her friend Charlene. And then she saw the Duke outside the door, who greeted and said that Lady Diana was a little late. Diana looked at Albert and remembered the thoughts that visited her during breakfast. But she immediately tried to get rid of them because he was her best friend's brother. And in the future, her daughter-in-law. But she kept looking at the Duke and thought she had really gone crazy. Albert handed the note to Diana, saying it was from Charlene. The girl read that Charlene was waiting for her 3 hours later, near the biggest tree. Before Diana had time to ask if the Duke had come just to deliver the note. He instantly picked up the girl and put her on the horse. A second later, they were already rushing towards the house where the alchemist lived. Albert sat so close that Diana felt his strong chest and firm arms. She felt uncomfortable from this proximity, decided to move a little further away, and began to lose her balance. The horse galloped so fast that the girl flew off and began to fall. The Duke instantly extended his hand, in time to grab Diana. One more second and the irreparable would have happened, but thanks to Albert, Diana was saved. He said, "Is the girl really so unpleasant that she was about to fall off the horse?" Then the Duke jumped to the ground and said there was only one horse, and he gave it to the lady. And he himself would try to get there as quickly as possible by another means. Diana followed him and ran to Fernando's house. Upon reaching the alchemist, Diana had already received the coveted bag, but Albert was still not there. And the girl began to worry. Finally, the Duke appeared in the doorway, and Diana rushed to meet him, but he ignored her. And immediately turned to Fernando. Diana was surprised and thought, why did Albert never do this, unlike her? The Duke asked Fernando how long the energy charge could be extended. The alchemist replied that it was about 4 hours, but this time he gave him a new portion and therefore he cannot say for sure. Albert said that it turns out there is no way to use the sedative yourself without resorting to Lady Diana's help. Fernando replied that so far they had successfully overcome the Duke's illness together, and that he would not recommend resorting to other dubious methods because Albert was his only test subject. Diana couldn't understand what she had done wrong, because before the Duke constantly sought an opportunity to see her. But now he wants to increase the time between their meetings. She wanted to ask Albert about this, but he asked her the question first. The Duke asked if Lady Diana really found his touch so unpleasant. Diana looked at Albert. She really wanted to say that everything was completely wrong. From his touch, she felt coldness. And if it were some kind of object, she wouldn't want to let it out of her hands. The Duke replied that her long silence spoke for itself and that she didn't have to answer. Diana was afraid of missing the moment to talk to Albert and tried to tell him that this was not the case at all. The Duke bowed politely, saying that in the future he would be careful not to touch the lady again. And he regretted that Diana had not said so earlier. Moving away from the girl, he apologized for thinking only of himself and his feelings. Diana thought that if at the moment, when she almost fell off the horse, she had not allowed the Duke to touch her, then trouble could have happened. The Duke looked at Diana again and said that she had no need to force herself to touch him. Arriving at the Raffaello house on 2 horses, one of which was taken from the alchemist, Diana saw that Charlene and Andrew had approached them, and her brother was clearly unhappy about something. He looked at his sister and said that if she had something to do, she really could be Sir Diego. Diana replied that they met by chance on the way, and Albert tried to confirm it. He added that the sun shone brightly today, and he was looking for a suitable umbrella for Lady Diana, which is why he was late. Diana accepted the umbrella and, turning to the Duke, silently showed a gesture indicating that a great idea had occurred to her. Charlene looked at her friend with a smile and suggested that instead of shopping, the 4 of them should go horseback riding to a place they hadn't been before. The Duke tried to suggest that she ride a horse with Lady Charlene. Andrew looked at the Duke bewilderedly and said that this was impossible and unnecessary because her fiancé was nearby. Albert replied if Andrew was really inviting him to ride a horse with Lady Diana. He added that if he did this, bad rumors could spread about Lady Diana. Diana understood that Albert recently tried to hold her hand all the time. And now he was moving away, not wanting to go together. And then Charlene said that everyone should go to a beautiful place. She has a great option that will suit all four. A minute later, Diana and her friend were riding on the same horse, heading to the place Charlene had indicated. Arriving at a beautiful clearing, Charlene said that this place was called Sunset Hill, and that she visited it often as a child. She added that she always wanted to come back here with the people she loves. Andrew looked around and told Charlene that from now on they would come here together often. The girls smiled at Andrew and told him that all four of them could also come here. Charlene then added that the men can now get off their horses and walk around this beautiful place. Andrew replied that he would do it as soon as possible anyway, because people were watching them all the time. Charlene smiled and replied that from the outside they looked like close friends. Then she suggested finding a spot in the clearing where all four of us could have a great picnic. Andrew, trying not to show his displeasure to the Duke, tried to stay as close as possible to Charlene, congratulating her and hugging her. And Diana at that moment began to lay out the food on the spread blanket. At that moment, a light summer breeze was blowing, but it was enough to spoil the piece of cake. Albert managed to put his hand on the edge of the blanket so that the dish wouldn't spoil. Diana put her hand over the Duke's and thanked him. Albert suggested having everything ready quickly so they could start with dessert. After some time, everything was ready, and Diana said she didn't think it would take longer than she expected. She thought to herself that everything was due to the partner who did nothing and didn't help. Diana looked at the Duke, who was 2 steps away from Andrew from her sister. From his look, it was clear that he was ready to rush and separate this couple at any cost. Diana felt a little sad, remembering the moment the Duke told her not to approach him again. There was a time when he gave a lot of advice to his friend and brother, and then she could only watch them from the side. Diana endured for a long time, but it seems that now this patience has come to an end. In aristocratic circles, the Valerian family was known for its hot temper. Diana tried to approach the Duke and talk, but he constantly moved away from her at a certain distance. And she couldn't stand it. And when she said she would like to apologize, Albert stopped and looked in her direction. He asked why the girl was apologizing, and she replied that she was wrong. Diana approached the Duke and told him that she had been avoiding him because she found him attractive, but that she felt uncomfortable when someone as handsome as Albert approached her. The Duke looked at the girl and replied that he did not expect to hear such a thing from Lady Diana. Looking at Albert, the girl really wanted to say that she felt embarrassed when the Duke approached her, and began to experience some vague feelings towards the man. But Diana stopped because of the fact that her brother Andrew and Charlene were already engaged. And double pairing was not very welcome in aristocratic circles, because marriages were created for this purpose to increase their power and territory. She told the Duke that although she felt some sympathy for him, she could not perceive him as a man. Diana added that in the future she will try to behave in such a way as not to give rise to further misunderstandings. She understood how difficult it was to avoid him, even with good intentions, but again, everything was very exhausting. It gave no rest. Diana suggested that the Duke should not avoid each other and, adhering to the framework, remain friends. Albert was silent for a while and then replied that he agreed to treat her as before. And he noticed that she was the first to suggest not running away from each other. He approached the girl and told her that he would make sure she remembered his words. And then Diana again experienced that strange feeling, because it turns out that with this conversation, she dug her own grave. And to get out of this somewhat awkward situation, Diana told the Duke that it was already starting to get dark. And besides, Charlene might think strangely about them. Albert asked why the lady had this concern, and Diana replied that they simply hadn't had a very serious conversation for too long. Then Charlene looked out from behind the tree and said that she called them, but they didn't come down. So she came to get them herself. Minutes later, all four were sitting on a blanket with all sorts of goodies and picnic snacks on it. Then Diana looked at Charlene and, without taking her eyes off her, asked if she wanted to tell her something. The girl replied no, but immediately fell silent, feeling uncomfortable because her friend kept staring at her. Seeing how uncomfortable his sister felt, the Duke offered her a cookie, telling her that it contained very rich raisins that he loved. Andrew smiled and said, "How can Sir Diego offer a girl a plate of such poor quality with raisins, which are called demon nipples?" Then Diana intervened and said that not both of them were behaving like little children in kindergarten. Charlene turned to her friend and whispered quietly in her ear that she now wanted to talk to her alone, moving away so the men couldn't hear them. Charlene told Diana that she wanted to tell her something about Sir Diego. The friend added that she had been planning to do this for a long time, but never dared. And now at the picnic, she decided to tell Diana everything. The girl was worried that Charlene would now tell her something she shouldn't know. Charlene gathered her courage and, with difficulty finding the words, told her friend that Sir Diego was actually her brother. Diana didn't know how to behave in this situation, whether to show surprise or simply remain silent. And Charlene added that she didn't tell her friend not because she didn't trust her, but simply because she was looking for the right moment to tell her everything. Diana took her friend's hands and told her that everything was fine, because she knew it since the Duke's arrival. Diana added that, although many years had passed, she still couldn't stop recognizing in Don Diego the Duke, whose portraits she had seen in her childhood. She told Charlene that a lot had happened lately, so she was waiting for her friend to tell her everything herself. Charlene asked if Diana could fulfill her request and still address her brother as a gentleman. Diana smiled, nodded, and said that today they should have fun. Andrew was restless the whole way back, and when he arrived at the house, he told Sir Diego that he had been a terrible travel companion. Jumping off almost in motion, the Duke replied that he completely agreed with him, which is why he was leaving first. Approaching the door, Charlene asked if Diana had noticed that there was such a tense relationship between them. And the girl replied that men would rather fight than make friends. Perhaps Andrew would change his mind about the gentleman if he found out who he really was. But Charlene said that such secrets should not be entrusted to him. Diana thought that if the men continue to treat each other this way, their relationship will completely deteriorate. And this could have negative consequences. She decided that she had to take care of one of the parties first and told her friend that she and her brother would go home because it was already late. Andrew opened his arms to hug her and, saying he wanted to say goodbye to Charlene, he headed towards the girls. But as soon as he approached, Diana abruptly grabbed him by the tie to stop him. She told her brother that she knew these farewells and that she wasn't going to wait for him for a couple of hours. Diana severely told Andrew to get back on the horse and wait for her there. Andrew did not argue with his younger sister and stepped aside, while Albert asked what Lady Diana was talking about with Charlene on the hill. Diana did not lie to Albert and replied that Charlene revealed that the Duke is her brother. Albert worried and asked if the girl had told about his illness, because his sister knew nothing about it. Diana replied that she told Charlene nothing, and then added that perhaps in the future her friend would be offended by this. The girl added that she still gives priority to her friend, but everything has a limit, especially patience. Then Diana turned to the Duke and told him that she would save him, no matter the cost, and that she would keep his secret under wraps for as long as necessary. Albert looked at Diana and asked if she was really willing to do everything possible to save him. The girls felt so embarrassed by the Duke's gaze that she covered her face with her hands. She turned around and was about to run to the horse, where her brother was waiting for her. But the Duke managed to grab Diana's hand, squeezed it tightly, and told her that he would trust her. And wait. Albert looked at the girl running, but then something made him turn towards the windows of the house. Charlene was standing on the balcony, and the Duke feared that his sister might not only see something, but also hear something. The girl knew her brother very well. Since childhood, he hated anyone touching him. Charlene placed her hands on the glass and was surprised, not understanding what was happening there. She saw her brother's and her friend's behavior and really wanted to hear what they were talking about. Charlene moved away from the window and was surprised, thinking that lately she had seen Albert. and Diana together very often. Seeing her brother and her friend holding hands, she remembered that this had already happened at a ball in the imperial palace. The next day, early in the morning, Andrew asked Diana what she was whispering with the gentleman about. And she indignantly replied, since when he started taking an interest in her personal affairs. The brother said that if she reacted like that to his question, it meant she liked the gentleman. But he would not allow this to happen. Diana replied that her own brother should understand that her thoughts and words are funny and absurd. But seeing the look of distrust in Andrew's eyes, Diana couldn't stand it, and said she had just said goodbye to Sir Diego, and that her brother was following her like a dog. Then a dispute started between them. The brother was outraged that his sister could call him a dog, and she yelled at him why he had been torturing her since the morning. Their fight lasted some time, and when Andrew went towards Diana, the maid was already running. After catching her breath, Daisy reported that the lady had received a letter from Prince Elvis from the imperial palace. The letter said he regretted Lady Diana's early departure from the ball, and that he would like to invite her to the palace along with her companion and friend Lady Raffaello. But when Diana read in the letter that tomorrow the prince would send a servant, it no longer looked like an invitation, but rather she had to obey. The next minute, the girl smiled, because the prince reminded her of a raccoon that was just as cunning and harmful. Diana handed the letter to the maid and asked her to bring her a cloak. When Daisy asked if the lady was going somewhere, Diana replied that she remembered she had some things to do. Diana stopped her horse near a small brick building that looked like a normal house. It was a cheap tavern for workers and a hotel for travelers, but it was only known to a small circle of people. In the hallway, Diana overheard empty talk from drunks about how the princess ran into the hall during a ball in the imperial palace and shouted at her servants. At the other end of the room, the discussion was that the next ruler should be none other than Prince Elvis. Diana looked around the venue and finally found the one she came here for. The girl raised her hood so the man would recognize her and quietly told him she had come to him with a request. It was Railwood, the hotel owner, and he said that if she needed anything, then everyone was busy. Rail was her friend and also the leader of the most famous information guild called OWL. The girl repeated that she had come to him with a request, and the man replied that they could go somewhere else where no one would hear them. This happened at the moment when Diana was just beginning to recall her past life. And while she was lying unconscious, it turned out that they had discovered a gold mine in the West. But she saw it in the novel. She bitterly thought that if she had remembered this earlier, she would have bought those lands. And if she had used them properly, she could have helped her brother in time. The novel said that the imperial palace announced a crackdown on information guilds, inciting people to rebel. And Ryle, the head of the Sova Guild, was from an aristocratic family and was one of the first to learn about it. To befriend him, Diana took advantage of the fact that she moved into someone else's body, and several times sold him information circulating among the aristocrats. Approaching one of the offices, Rail opened the door and said that no one would hear them here, and that it was good Diana came because he also wanted to talk to her. When they entered the office, the man said that his people said that lately they often see Diana in an alley near the laboratory of a crazy alchemist who studies the lands of the North. He then added that he didn't think Lady Diana visited this place without some reason or purpose. Diana replied that he was right, and she is indeed there sometimes, gathering information about the northern lands. But nothing is known yet. As soon as she finds out something specific, she will definitely tell him. Rail said that he does not rule out the possibility that it is related to Raffaello. The man added that Diana always starts to worry when it comes to her brother or friend Charlene. Diana smiled and replied that this time she came with a slightly different question. The girl looked at Ray and asked him to tell her about Prince Elvis. The next morning, the prince sent a carriage as promised, and Lady Diana headed to the imperial palace. The palace park looked very expensive and seemed as if all the statues in the world were gathered here. As she walked along the path, Diana suddenly heard someone calling her. The girl turned around and saw Duke Albert. Diana asked surprised how he could find her. Albert replied that when he arrived here, he saw the lady turn towards this part of the garden. And thinking she might get lost, he followed her. After these words, the Duke took another path, and Lady Diana decided she should follow him. The girl thanked the Duke for his concern and asked where Charlene was, because they were supposed to arrive together. Albert replied that his sister was walking in the garden and that Lady Diana had no reason to worry about her. The girl asked him if it was a matter of tact that the Duke was with her now, and not with his sister, to which he replied that Charlene herself had sent him to look for Diana. Suddenly, the girl asked if something had happened to her friend Charlene because she felt some kind of anxiety. The Duke turned around and asked surprised what kind of feeling this anxiety is. And without waiting for an answer, he added that it turns out his sister Charlene is much more mature than he thought. The Duke said that he was not satisfied with the fact that time passed so quickly, and that it had nothing to do with his sister. The next second, Albert turned and took Diana's hand, but she didn't pull it away because she was beginning to get used to it. Suddenly, from these touches, everything around her began to shine with an aquamarine light. It turned out that the Duke had a piece of glass in his hands, which he received from the alchemist. Diana looked at Albert, and he told her that this way he would not lose the glass. The Duke looked at the girl with gray eyes and could barely contain his smile. Elvis courteously greeted Charlene and Diana, and the girls saw that, in addition to the prince, Princess Deborah was sitting at the table. Elvis gallantly pulled out her chair and said that Lady Diana could sit here. Diana thanked the prince. She felt flattered that he pointed out the seat next to him to her. Elvis added that all the animals living in the palace are kept in cages, and that Lady Diana should not worry. Then he turned to Charlene and told her that he had heard that her sister Deborah had behaved rudely at the ball. Charlene smiled sweetly and replied that everything was fine. She added that, as an older brother, he would like to apologize for his behavior, and Deborah didn't even seem to listen to him at that moment. The princess tried to catch Diane's eye with her eyes. Perhaps it was because the girl saw her cry. Elvis turned to the princess and told her that she needed to apologize for her behavior at the ball. Deborah was silent for a while, but finally looked at Charlene and apologized to her for that evening. Charlene smiled again and said she had already forgotten about it. When everyone sat down and started eating, there was a general awkward silence at the table. The prince spoke first and told the Duke that he had heard that Sir Diego was staying at the Raffaello estate. Albert replied that he was temporarily enjoying his hospitality. The Duke found this strange, as he had never told anyone where he was staying. Elvis apparently understood the bewilderment of his interlocutor and replied that he hadn't told him anything personally, but that the gentleman was very famous in the north. When the prince added that he heard about him from friends, Diana knew it was a lie. Immediately after visiting Rail, a man was sent who obtained information by bribing one of the people close to the prince. And he admitted that he had been tasked with finding out everything about Nathan Diego. Then, Elvis asked the Duke if he had any kind of relationship with Lady Diana, since they were together at the ball. To this unexpected question, Diana dropped her fork and apologized while wondering why the prince decided to drag her here. While the servant was changing the fork, the girl felt very uncomfortable. Diana saw that the prince was looking at her and replied that they had a completely different relationship. It's just that at that moment, she didn't have a partner, and Sir Diego agreed to be one for the duration of the ball. Elvis laughed imperceptibly, and then asked if Lady Diana really had no acquaintances with whom she could attend the event. The next minute, he got up and approached the girl at an almost indecent distance. Diana decided that perhaps the prince could not obtain certain information, and now he is trying to find it out through her. The girl remembered that Rail said that an audit was also organized against Sir Diego. But like the prince, they couldn't find out much, since Diego was an orphan from a bankrupt aristocratic family. The only thing they managed to find out was that he lost his parents at an early age and moved north at an early age. Diana replied to the prince that she didn't have such acquaintances, and that's why she invited him. Elvis moved even closer and asked, almost in her ear, if he could ask Lady Diana a very personal question. Then he straightened his back and, coming a little closer, asked if she had a lover. Diana felt as if a bucket of ice water had been thrown over her, and replied that she preferred to spend time with her family rather than get involved in a romantic relationship. The girl tried to smile and added that the time has not yet come, and she prefers to dedicate herself to self-development. Now Diana was sure that the prince had set a real test for her, and then suddenly asked if Lady Diana really had no time and desire even for him. Elvis's behavior already looked like light flirting because he pays so much attention to her for nothing. In 10 years, the prince will organize a rebellion and take the imperial throne. And if Diana starts a relationship with him, she will be drawn into this political whirlwind. If Elvis really feels sincere sympathy for her, this will still cause problems. The prince told Diana that not everything he said today was a joke. Charlene tried to grasp the essence of the conversation, but found it difficult. Albert behaved with a bit of caution. He also did not fully understand what Elvis meant. And then the prince, seeing a bent fork in Albert's hands, said that he hoped the palace was watching this. After all, it is customary to get rid of spoiled and rusty things. Albert looked at his fork and realized that he had mechanically bent it while listening to this tense conversation. And then Elvis said that he wanted to ask Sir Diego something. Princess Deborah stopped eating and looked at her brother. Apparently, she was also very interested in this whole conversation. The prince looked at the Duke and asked if he liked Lady Diana Valerian. Without waiting for an answer, Elvis asked why Sir Diego had such a fierce look. To which he replied that he had faced death more than once while in the north. And perhaps this affected his gaze. Here Albert said, if he told the prince that he was interested in Lady Diana, he would be satisfied with this answer. Diana first looked at the Duke, and then at the prince, and didn't know how this tense conversation would end. Elvis told the gentleman that his answer would not suit him anyway. The girls watched the men's dialogue in silence, and all three felt uncomfortable. Elvis looked at everyone present and suddenly burst out laughing. Then he told the Duke that there was no need for Sir Diego to act so cautiously with him. When the hot food arrived, Elvis said that now everyone could move on to the main course. Diana looked at the prince and was not happy that he was using her to test Duke Albert. After all, Duke Raffaello, whom Elvis knew, would have reacted with complete indifference to this whole situation. Since childhood, the Duke was famous for his strong character and inaccessibility. For a person who doesn't find it so easy to make friends, falling in love with a lady he doesn't know well, that would be very uncharacteristic of him. Apparently, that's why he basically called her and Charlene to see how Sir Diego would behave. And Albert behaved with dignity during the conversation. Apparently, he figured out the prince's plan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have reacted like that. Diana remembered the Duke's words to the prince that he might be interested in Lady Diana. And even in the presence of Charlene. Charlene also behaved calmly, apparently. She also realized that her brother was behaving in such a way that the prince would not recognize him. And then Diana felt her heart pounding, and an unpleasant feeling arose inside her. Once the storm passed, the rest of the lunch hour passed in complete silence. The prince was the first to get up from the table, saying he had business ahead. Because he was helping in the management of a trade guild belonging to his maternal relatives. Then the princess got up and said that since the meal was over, then everyone had to leave too. As everyone headed towards the exit, Deborah called Diana. She quietly apologized for her brother's behavior and the tense atmosphere at the table. The Duke noticed this, but Diana pretended as if nothing had happened. Already sitting in the carriage, she expressed her opinion that perhaps the princess was not as bad as she seemed from the outside. Charlene was indignant that her friend was mistaken, because everyone perfectly saw what happened at the ball. Diana replied that there are usually serious rumors about people of high birth, and that you cannot believe everything. Charlene indignantly asked if her friend was now on Princess Deborah's side. Albert looked silently out the window and wondered what kind of courage the princess had. These were probably the requirements of the emperor. And there is no point in accusing the still very young princess of something. Moreover, Deborah also suffered. Of course, it was true that the princess intimidated Charlene, but you can't say she's really evil. But it was a mystery to the Duke. He didn't know how Lady Diana would communicate with the prince in the future. Albert was surprised, thinking that he found it unpleasant to see Diana communicating with one of the other men. He couldn't help but look at her, and someday, perhaps, the day would come when these feelings would become his weakness and not poison his life. The Duke thought that it was necessary to nip this in the bud before they became mortal enemies. But not even in his imagination could he kill Lady Diana. Charlene looked at her friend and said that when the princess talked to Diana, she felt like something was being taken away from her. Diana replied that nothing and no one could influence their relationship and separate them. Charlene looked into her friend's eyes and told her that she loved her very much, and that's why she was jealous when she communicated with someone. The Duke listened to the girls' conversation and understood that these were the words to describe this feeling. But the event that forced Albert to admit his feelings came sooner than he thought. A few days before a certain acquaintance, a very important conversation took place at the Valerian estate. The mother persuaded Diana to go to a single meeting because it was not necessary to gather together. Besides, she herself said she felt lonely. Diana remembered that, when she was about 10 years old, she liked a boy. They were boring ballrooms where adults talked to each other. That's why they often met and played together in the garden. The mother continued to insist that Diana have at least one date, because she had found it very difficult to secure this option from Mrs. Houston. Baroness Houston was the best matchmaker in the world and claimed that all the girls she could introduce ended up marrying successfully. Diana was starting to get tired of this conversation and promised her mother that she would go on that date. A few days later, Princess Deborah was surprised to read an article in the newspaper about matchmaking. And she was surprised. The prince was no less surprised because Diana said she wasn't interested in relationships. Charlene also managed to read an article about Diana's potential dates and was upset because her friend hadn't told her anything about it. She told her brother about this, but Albert couldn't say anything because he didn't know how to react. At that moment, many letters had already piled up on the table in the office of the Valerian estate, and each of them contained an invitation for a date. Daisy said there were already rumors about the mistress's dates, and Diana was indignant about the fact that strangers always meddle in other people's personal lives. Taking one of the letters, the girl burned it, saying that some of them irritated her greatly. When the letter was almost burned, Diana said she would go all the way and that she needed to leave now. The maid asked where the lady was going, and then added that they still had a lot of preparations to make, since Lady Diana had forgot that she wasn't just Daisy. And then she added that they don't have time to walk, because the date is in 2 days. And they need to look perfect. But the next moment, Diana jumped out the window and left barefoot somewhere. After a while, the girl, breathless, stopped to catch her breath. She had difficulty finding a gap too large in the fence that she had used when she was a child. But suddenly Brother Andrew appeared from behind, who said that he had closed this hole a long time ago. When they grew up, when Diana got angry and said that her brother always ruins everything and that he is useless, Andrew got angry, saying, "How can she talk to him like that?" The girl replied that he is not much older than her. Andrew chuckled and said it seemed that the time had come to call the parents and the servants. Before the girl had time to ask her brother not to do this, he had already started yelling at his mother. The next minute, Andrew fell in front of his sister, and the Duke was behind him. Diana looked at Albert and at first could not understand what had happened to her brother. Surprised, the girl asked the question that came to mind: did the Duke really come to see her brother? Albert replied, "Really, it looks like a man who has nothing else to do." Diana said that if the Duke came for treatment, then now is not the time, because she is going to Fernando's house. But Albert kept looking persistently at Diana. The Duke frowned. This greatly frightened Diana, and she thought that he should leave now. To prevent Albert's anger from worsening, the girl tried to say that he was a very handsome man. And it seemed to work. She added that when she first met Albert, she was initially afraid of his coldness. But now she knows that he is not like that at all. And if he had officially arrived in the capital, he would have become the first handsome man long ago. Diana tried to praise the Duke, saying that he is very caring and thinks a lot about his family. The Duke interrupted her and told her that he felt that she was still afraid of him. Diana tried to justify herself by saying that she was only afraid at the beginning of their relationship. Albert approached and, smiling, suggested starting over from this place. Diana looked at the Duke surprised and replied that she didn't quite understand what he meant. And then the Duke noticed that the girl was completely barefoot and shoeless. And he sat at her feet. He touched her feet, and Diana could not explain the stupid situation to him. Before the girl had time to come to her senses, Albert picked her up and told her to hold on tight. The next second, the Duke jumped incredibly high and landed softly on the other side of the fence. Albert said that the first thing to do was look for a shoe store, because if Lady Diana walked like this, she could hurt herself. He asked the girl if she disliked being in his arms, and Diana replied that she liked it very much. But the girl immediately corrected herself and said that she liked the store located across the street. In the Duke's behavior and words, she sensed a kind of cunning. In the shoe store, Albert put the shoes he had chosen on the girl's feet. At that moment, Diana felt an incomprehensible feeling and felt like Cinderella. After a while, they were on the porch of the temple, and the Duke asked why they were there. Because Diana was going to visit the alchemist. The girl did not tell Albert that Fernando had a request in the letter which, among other things, was related to a date. She simply told the Duke that the alchemist had asked for some holy water. And Alberto replied that it was unlikely they would give it to her, as she had arrived without prior notice. But then a maid came out onto the porch and said that Mr. Matthew was waiting inside. Only a few people knew about his existence and his ability to predict the future. Matthew was above all religions and could be compared to a high priest. He was even called a messenger of God. Diana knew that giving him a few boxes of holy water was a common and trivial matter. The Duke and Diana had to wait a little while, because at that moment the blind prophet was always praying. When Matthew turned to them, Diana apologized for possibly disturbing his prayer. The prophet said that everything was in order because he invited her himself, and besides, they could talk quietly here. The prophet then added that he was not surprised that they came here together, because he saw it in a dream. The Duke was hostile, saying that such words should not be spoken about prophetic dreams. He sees that the temple is poor, and the parishioners are attracted here specifically with such tricks. The prophet was not angry at all. He simply put his hand to his chest and said that the guest could think whatever he wanted. Diana looked at the prophet and thought that he was a true messenger of God. He was not intimidated, even in front of the Duke. Matthew turned his head towards Diana and said that he had prepared what she asked for. Then he added that this time, he would not accept money from Lady Diana. And then Matthew said strange words that everything would not end today. Prophet Matthew belonged to the Temple of the Moon, which was not a major religion. And according to the plot, this fact did not favor him. The prince's knights began to oppress small religions, and the prophet was captured. Diana understood that Matthew probably knew everything in advance, and in particular, that Diana's circumstances would help him. The Duke looked at the prophet and Lady Diana and could not understand why they were smiling at each other. After receiving the box of holy water, Alberto was impatient to leave. And he told the prophet that they were in a hurry. Matthew replied that seeing Lady Diana was enough for him, and then turned to the Duke and told him that he should not be so careful because he felt everything. Diana initially thought it was her imagination, but she actually noticed dissatisfaction in Albert's behavior. The prophet understood that all this was due to jealousy and said that he was a priest. And he had no interest in marriage or romantic relationships. Then he added that since the guest came with his good friend, he could talk about his future. The prophet said that he usually does not offer such a thing to other people, but for her sake, he will make an exception. Matthew looked at the Duke and said that he had seen something and suggested that he continue doing everything as before. Then he turned his head towards Diana and said that in time she would understand everything. Fernando proudly showed the crystals and said that he was able to make them with the help of the holy water they brought. The alchemist gave it to Diana and told her that she should definitely use it, as he wanted to see the result of his action. Then, sadly, Fernando said that he regretted not being able to see each other because Lady Diana was getting married soon. He explained that he had seen an article in the newspaper about a possible wedding, and in that case, the gentleman would urgently have to look for another bearer of the fire. And then the Duke replied that what Fernando feared would never happen. Diana tightly clutched the crystal in her hands and said she was Ballista. The Duke approached the girl. He offered her his hand and told her that he was also ready to do her this favor. Diana looked into Albert's eyes, and the whole room lit up with a bright blue glow. Thus continued the girl's usual life, and the day of the date arrived. He entered the cafe and said that he had made a reservation in the name of Lady Diana Valerian. The kind waiter replied that he would be delighted to see her off. Diana looked at him and was surprised to see that it was Rael, and then she remembered that among the letters she received there was a message from him. The letter said that Rael regretted not knowing about Diana's desire to marry first. So they could have sold this information for a very high price, and if he had known earlier, he would have started acting more bravely. Diana thought that she could have guessed it earlier, as soon as she received the letter. That Rael, offended, followed her even here, with the opportunity to mock her. The girl remembered the photograph of Count Bott that her mother had shown her, and decided to simply look at him and leave immediately. The next second, someone called her by name, and Diana turned around. It was Count Sebastian Button, but for some reason his appearance was very different from what she saw in the photograph. At first, the girl thought that Ray had deliberately brought her to another man to mock her. The man gallantly pushed out her chair so that Diana could sit down, and she decided that perhaps she was mistaken. And then one of the chair legs stepped on the hem of the dress and almost tore it. Sebastian apologized for his awkward behavior and said that perhaps he was too worried trying to please the girl. Diana tried not to get nervous and asked how long Sir Button had been waiting for her. The Count replied that, to be honest, he had waited a long time, but for a date with such a beautiful lady, he could have waited longer. Diana was surprised by this answer, as he arrived 5 minutes early. Rael approached and invited them to open the menu and choose dishes. Inside, she saw a note from Rael that said there were many visitors today. But she didn't understand what that meant. Diana said she would have cream soup with veal, and Rael asked if one soup was enough. The girl replied that in the morning she felt a slight discomfort in her stomach, and Sebastian immediately said that he felt the same way. Apparently, she was also worried before the meeting, like him, and didn't sleep all night. Diana did not find the Count's self-confidence very pleasant, and due to the headache that appeared. The girl did not immediately understand that Rael's note meant that today not only him, but also other visitors were watching them. Disgusted, Andrew asked Charlene why the gentleman was with them now. The girl, looking at the menu, replied that for security reasons she promised her brother, and to escort this gentleman everywhere. Albert, also closing his menu, replied that he would tell the Duke everything about Andrew's discontent. Then Charlene intervened and said that if they were spying on someone else's date, then they should be quiet, and above all, not to fight. When the men calmed down a bit, Charlene wondered if Albert really liked Diana so much that he even agreed to follow her. She looked at her brother and remembered the moments when she saw them together with her friend. Charlene initially thought that if this was true, if they broke up, it could affect her friendship with Diana. But then I made sure it was a vain concern, because my brother always valued what he had. After all, even as a child, Albert tried to mend the blanket she used to cover herself with, and he still keeps it in his chest. Charlene already began to have hopes that they would be together, and dreamed that the four of them would have double dates. And suddenly she heard how, at the next table, the Count accused Diana of leading an indecent lifestyle, calling her a cunning woman who relies only on her appearance. He said that if she doesn't attend banquets, she is probably different from other ladies. But in his opinion, she looked exactly the same, and there was nothing to see except her face. Charlene turned to her table for a moment and saw that neither her brother nor Andrew were there. Both men stood with swords near the Count and threatened to pay for their words. Just a few minutes ago, Diana heard how the Count praised himself, saying that most of the lands belonged to his family, that he loved to save money and was sure they were suitable for each other. Sebastian claimed that he had such an elegant appearance that it made the hearts of many girls tremble. But he was looking for exactly one who was at his level, so he rejected all others. Diana nodded in contact at his words and thought that he was very self-confident. And talked too much. The Count said that he had finally made his decision and was ready to start an official relationship with Lady Diana. Diana turned a little and said that the Count deserved something better and perhaps he would meet someone better than her. Sebastian replied bewilderedly that his money and her beauty could be the best combination. The girl smiled slightly and replied that she had plenty of money and did not need it. This answer finally enraged the Count, and then insults followed against Lady Diana. The Count, with swords at his neck, only had time to ask who they were. Charlene quickly sat down next to Diana and asked since when her friend was dating such rude boors. Andrew pressed his weapon against the Count's throat and introduced himself as Lady Diana's brother. And then he added that all his words would be conveyed to the head of the Valerian family. And then Diana asked everyone to stop and explain what the three of them were doing here. At the Valerian estate, loud conversations did not cease until the evening. Miss Houston tried to apologize for suggesting such a candidate for a date, but it couldn't be because all her candidates had been carefully vetted. The Valerian family did not ignore this, and a lawsuit was filed in court against Count Sebastian Button. Later, Diana said while drinking tea that thanks to Charlene and the gentleman who served her family, she managed to get out of this situation. The parents asked who this gentleman was, and Andrew replied that he was protecting Lady Charlene by order of his brother. And suddenly, the mother offered to invite this gentleman to dinner and invite him to a delicious meal. The whole family looked at their mother in surprise, but she only said that everyone should find time for his visit tomorrow. To the servants' astonishment, Diana was already sitting on the porch since the morning, because she had been thinking all night about the Duke's visit and could not sleep. The girl thought that Albert was hiding his identity, but yesterday he committed such a dangerous act. Diana read an article in the newspaper about yesterday's incident in which, thank God, the Duke was not mentioned, and it seemed to her that, after all, it was Rael's doing. Suddenly, a hooded stranger approached her and asked what she was reading with such interest. Frightened, Diana jumped up, and the servants were already running towards her to throw out the stranger. They ordered the lady to urgently enter the house, and Diana, recognizing Albert in the stranger, said that everything was in order and that this was her acquaintance. Diana saw blood on the Duke's face and hands and tried to quickly pull him away from the servants. Entering the garden with the Duke, she asked him why he was injured, and he replied that he was simply issuing a warning. Diana excitedly asked who Albert had beaten, or if something worse had happened. The girl remembered that the Duke should not attract attention and expose himself to danger so as not to be recognized. The Duke replied that he did everything cleanly and punished everyone, except the scoundrel. After all, there is no better way to punish a person than to show them retaliation against those who protect them. Diana asked why Albert intervened in this matter, personally putting himself in danger. The Duke replied that he would never allow anything or anyone belonging to him to be harmed. Diana replied that no stolen object could be so valuable as to cause the Duke to expose himself to great danger. Albert asked surprisedly if the lady was really worried about him, and the girl replied yes. The Duke replied that he was pleased with the girl's concern, and that perhaps sometimes he would do such things to experience this feeling. The girl replied that she was saying terrible words because she wasn't just worried about him now. She shouldn't think about that. She put on a stern expression and said that next time she would tell Charlene everything. But Albert, without listening to her, asked her again if she had really been worried about him before. And the girl realized that she had let slip something unnecessary again. To quickly change the subject, Diana reminded the Duke that he was invited to an official dinner. Seeing the Duke's surprised look, Diana explained that Charlene and he, or rather Sir Diego, had been invited to dinner in gratitude for yesterday's action. The Duke looked at the girl and told her that in that case, they would see each other at dinner. Upon returning to the estate, Albert urgently needed to change his clothes before Charlene saw him in this state. But then, luckily, his sister entered and said she wouldn't ask why her brother was in this state. But she would only ask him one question. Charlene looked at Albert and asked what he felt for Lady Diana. She added that she needed to know what he thought of her and who she was to him. The Duke remained silent with his bloodied shirt in front of his sister. The next day, Charlene and the Duke arrived together at the Valerian estate. Once everyone was gathered around the large table, lunch began smoothly. Andrew asked the Duke to step aside and then said that, of course, he could have done it alone. But still, he was grateful that he had defended his sister's honor. Albert extended his hand to him and told him there was no need to thank him, because he did what a true gentleman should do. The girls saw their brothers and sighed with relief, because their fights would finally end. Charlene told her friend that finally the four of them could safely go for a walk. Then Andrew asked Charlene if she could go somewhere with him, and she asked him if it was just the two of them. Andrew felt a little embarrassed and said there was a gift for her and that perhaps it had already been delivered. The girl replied that of course she would go with him, but for some reason at that moment she turned to Diana and winked at her. They walked away, leaving the Duke and Diana alone. The girl looked at Albert and was surprised that he didn't try to follow them, and then said that it seemed her brother didn't bother her so much anymore. The Duke replied that his sister offered him a deal, and now he is considering whether to accept it or not. Then he suggested returning to the balcony and continuing with lunch. After a while, Charlene and Andrew returned, and the girl was holding a huge bouquet of flowers. Approaching the table, Andrew decided to joke, saying that he himself wouldn't understand where Charlene was and where the flowers were. Diana was surprised, and at the same time happy that the Duke acted so calmly. Andrew turned to Charlene and told her that he had given her this bouquet because he wanted to tell her something. Andrew mustered his courage and continued, saying that after what happened with Diana, he feared that Charlene could go to the north with the gentleman, and there she would meet a young man and marry him. Therefore, he decided to go to the north personally and get permission from his brother to marry. And then he knelt down, gave Charlene a box with a ring, and asked her if she would marry him if he received permission. Everyone froze, waiting for an answer, but Charlene remained silent. Andrew got up from his knees, apologized to Charlene, and told her that he couldn't resist, and that he was in a hurry. Diana looked at what was happening with regret, because she knew how difficult it was for her brother to say these words. For the Valerian family, the North is an environment completely contrary to their nature. And his words meant that he was ready to risk his life for Charlene. Charlene replied that her words did not mean that she rejected him. Then the Duke got up from the table and told Andrew that he did not need to go to the north. Andrew replied that if the gentleman offers to transmit information through him, then this does not suit him, because he himself wanted to speak personally with Duke Raffaello. Albert said that this is why Andrew can tell him everything, because he is Duke Raffaello. Andrew replied that he had seen the family portrait, and Sir Diego did not look like the Duke at all. Even if he wore a wig, it was impossible to change the color of his eyes. He added that the stupid joke of this gentleman was completely inappropriate. He was very reserved, and that's why Andrew didn't like him at all. The next moment, his anger crossed all limits, and Andrew summoned fire with his abilities. Diana instantly covered her friend and shouted at her brother to stop immediately. The Duke, engulfed in flames, instantly drew his sword. But it seems this did not stop Andrew and only intensified the flames. A real battle of ice and fire began. The next second, Andrew saw the same legendary ice sword. This was the sword technique of the Raffaello family that even pierced magic. After extinguishing the fire and putting away the sword, the Duke asked if Andrew believed him now. Things changed at the Raffaello estate, and at some point, Andrew called the Duke his brother. He seemed to try to please the Duke, and even brought 30-year-old vintage wine. Albert was very surprised when Andrew suddenly called him brother. At that moment, Diana arrived at the estate, and Charlene, surprised, asked why Andrew was behaving so strangely. She added that she was afraid something might happen, and they would fight again. Diana replied that they were on the Raffaello estate, so nothing would happen, and her friend could rest assured. She then turned to Charlene and told her that even though her brother didn't like Andrew, she was sure he wouldn't hurt him. Then she added that they could leave the men alone and safely do their hair. The Duke sat on the sofa and thought that as soon as Andrew found out who he really was, he would start behaving completely differently. When Andrew entered the girls' bathroom, Diana asked if there was any progress in their relationship. Andrew sighed and said no, it seems the Duke still doesn't trust him. Charlene looked at him sadly and asked if she could talk to him now. Diana realized that now it was worth leaving them alone and went out. After a while, the girl felt that the sun was shining too much. She covered her face with her hand and decided it was better to return to the house. Suddenly, the Duke appeared nearby and asked if the lady was hurt, and Diana replied that she was just covering herself from the sun. Albert removed the girl's hand and placed his palm on her forehead. Diana felt a familiar coolness and, thanking the Duke, said that everything was fine now. The girl added that she was leaving, and Albert replied that he would accompany her to the carriage. Diana wanted to thank the Duke, but then he said that he could accompany her home. The girl quickly replied that there was no need to worry about this. She will get there herself. Diana quickly wished the Duke a good day and headed towards the carriage. Albert did not reply. He just thought that her behavior was funny. Prince Elvis read the newspaper with interest, especially the article exposing the character and the conduct of Count Botan. A minute later, he called a servant and ordered him to deal with this count immediately. The prince asked what new things had been learned about Sir Diego. The servant replied that he contacted all information guilds in the capital, and only one managed to get information, and a portrait of this gentleman as a child was received. He showed the prince a portrait and told him that the gentleman came from a bankrupt aristocratic family. His parents died of an illness just as he was born. Elvis said he was very disappointed with this sparse information because he wanted to show his best side to the emperor. The thing is, the emperor tried several times to send spies to watch the Duke, but most of them died on the way or all contact with them was lost. Even if someone managed to reach the northern lands, it was almost impossible to leave there. The prince told the servant that he had sent a man to the north, but there had been no news from him for a whole month. Perhaps something had happened to him. The servant replied that there was a magic device for this case, but they could not use it now, since there was no energy left in the crystals. Elvis replied that tomorrow he would meet with his uncle and get the crystals himself. When the Duke first arrived in the north, he thought that the harsh living conditions would quickly ruin him, as happened to other visitors. However, at some point, the northerners began to see him as an irreplaceable person. With the exception of one person. Due to the Duke's departure, all matters were transferred to Assistant Eric. But there seemed to be too much to do. The real Sir Diego said that he too would do well to wash up. The assistant replied that all the inconveniences should be blamed on the gentleman who had left. Sir Diego replied that, on the contrary, he was grateful to him that if it wasn't for the Duke, he would have remained starving on the street. The assistant was also aware of the secret agreement between the Duke and Sir Diego, having received the Duke's approval for the marriage and Charlene's consent. Andrew was as happy as a child and thought that the wedding ceremony should be held in a more beautiful place than where the engagement took place. When Diana asked him why he was making so much noise, Andrew replied that he had come to brag that he had a date today. Then the brother asked what Diana was going to do today, and the girl replied that she planned to go with her friend. Andrew looked at his sister surprised and asked if she really had friends besides Charlene. Rael was an excellent friend, but it turned out that up to a certain point, as soon as Diana entered the tavern. He offered her his insinuations, as well as his feelings, to which the girl responded with a blunt refusal. saying that she had not come here for that. And the workers only encouraged him to act more bravely, or one of them would introduce the lady to his nephew. Rael told the girl that there were too many eyes and ears here, and suggested she go to a nearby cafe, run by an acquaintance of his. Upon leaving, he joked that it was their first date, and Diana snatched his notebook and wrote something in it. When she showed Rael the torn piece of paper, only one question arose. Was he responsible for the published article? Rael smiled and replied that he prepared everything. And their further conversation continued with the help of notes, from which Diana learned that Rael had received an order from the emperor to find out everything about Nathan Diego. Rael, of course, fulfilled the order, but having received the money, he sold false information. Fortunately, he visited Prophet Matthew in advance. Then, having made a fake portrait, he sold it to the emperor. Diana sighed with relief, hoping that the emperor would not find out the truth, and patted Rayla on the head. The boy said that Diana only owed him 20 coins for his services due to an old friendship. The girl replied that she did not have money with her at the moment. Rael said that in that case, they could just have lunch together. Having ordered almost all the dishes on the menu, he said that when visiting someone else's establishment, you must try everything. And then Diana heard a very familiar voice, and it was her brother's voice. She carefully turned her head and was surprised to see Andrew, Charlene, and the Duke entering the cafe. Albert complained to him that he constantly called him brother, and Andrew replied that the Duke was older than him. That's why he addressed him that way. Charlene advised them to be calmer in the restaurant and cafe. And she was very unhappy that they only communicated among themselves. When the three of them sat at the next table, Diana felt great excitement. She told Rael that they should leave here quietly, and asked him to discreetly look at the next table. He quickly took her hand and told her that he knew where the emergency exit was. They tried to hide to go unnoticed, but Charlene managed to notice them. After running several blocks, Diana said she was very tired and wanted to go home. Rael asked the girl if she could do him a favor and go to the store with him because he needed to buy something. He explained that this place is quite gloomy, and he is afraid to go alone. Finally, Diana gave in and accepted his complaints. After a while, they stood in front of a building that looked more like an abandoned one, where they were doing something illegal. Rael, surprised by the girl, explained that the goods he needed could only be found here. Crystals can usually be bought in official stores, and you can also provide your personal information. And here they could be acquired without formalities and at a lower price. Diana suggested that perhaps they should hide their identities. And Rael replied that this would not be necessary, as he personally knew the owner. The next moment, Diana was very frightened when two hooded strangers approached her. One of them said that the lady easily recognized him as soon as she heard his voice. As soon as the stranger took off his hood, Diana recognized him as Prince Elvis. The prince looked at the girl and said that it seemed they were now in the same boat. Sitting in the same carriage with the prince and his entourage, Diana felt uncomfortable. She had no idea that Elvis might show up in this place. The prince asked if it was really unnecessary to bring Lady Diana's acquaintance along. The girl replied positively and added that if someone recognized him, trouble might arise. She couldn't imagine that the prince could destroy the Information Guild and kill all its members when he took the throne. When Diana mustered the courage to ask the prince what he was doing in that place, the assistant said that he did not have to answer her question. But Elvis pointed at the man and said that he was his uncle, whose name was Baron Claude de Ciro, and that he was the head of the Merchant Guild. The Baron added that he sometimes accompanies the prince when he needs to explore the market. Then, Elvis said that if he had answered Lady Diana's question, she could ask him the same. The girl fell silent because she couldn't tell him the reason for her presence in this store. But the prince didn't wait for her answer, but asked her what she felt for him, and if he was really good. Then he added that he had read in the newspaper that Lady Diana had been courted by Count Botan. It might be that the girl had rejected the prince for him. Diana again felt uncomfortable and replied that she had never imagined such a thing. But that unforeseen circumstances had occurred. The rest of the journey passed in silence, but Diana constantly felt the prince's gaze on her. When the carriage arrived at the Valyrian estate, the prince said he would look forward to the next contingency. The next morning, Diana felt very ill, and Daisy said the lady had a cold. And sick. The girl expected a quick recovery, but the longer time passed, the higher the temperature rose. And Diana slept all the time. The doctor examined Diana and said that in normal life, her temperature was elevated due to genetic characteristics. The worried parents asked if common medicines really couldn't help. And the doctor replied that this illness was associated with physical characteristics, and that not even priests could cope with it. The girl lay in bed and thought if it was so hard for her because of a simple fever. So, how did the Duke feel in his illness? She woke up in the middle of the night, due to extreme thirst, and suddenly saw her mother who had fallen asleep at the edge of her bed. And then, looking around, she was amazed to see that the whole family remained with her. Knowing they were worried and concerned about her, Diana wanted to cry. For a moment, she thought she had lost her abilities due to an illness, because she was very hot. And the room was stuffy. The girl decided that perhaps they were also hot and began to open the balcony door. Diana went out onto the balcony and took a deep breath of the fresh air. A pleasant night breeze ran over her body and stirred her hair. The next moment, the girl felt a slight chill on her shoulders. She turned around and was paralyzed with amazement. It was the Duke. Diana decided it was just a dream and really wanted to snuggle up next to Albert. The girl hugged the Duke and rested her head on his chest. She felt like she felt better. And then, suddenly, the pleasant coolness turned into an unbearable burning sensation inside. The Duke took her head between his hands and said that Lady Diana seemed to have a fever again, and that her temperature was rising. But the girl hugged Albert again and didn't want to leave him even for a second. The Duke said Diana's temperature was much higher than usual, and the girl replied that her temperature, on the contrary, was lower than usual. Diana said that a few minutes ago she was tormented by intense thirst, but now everything has passed. Then the girl asked if the Duke really felt just as well after the treatment. Albert said he was very worried about Lady Diana, lest she got worse. Diana smiled at the Duke and asked him to stay in her arms a little longer. In the morning, the mother heard Diana and said that if there were guests, they would definitely notice it. And the father added that if a stranger had entered the house, he or her brother would know immediately. Diana sighed and replied that it seemed she had dreamed everything. And her mother said that because of the fever, dreams were confused with reality. Then she added that Diana's fever wasn't going down, and she needed to call a doctor. But the girl said it was just a cold. Andrew said that mages never get sick like this, and everyone was worried and scared for her. After a second visit from the doctor, he said it was difficult to determine the cause. Therefore, mages and alchemists were summoned, and they created total chaos. Later, they issued a verdict that it seemed the body had physically failed due to high mana consumption. The mother looked at Diana surprised and said that this was the capital, not a battlefield, and that her daughter couldn't use that much. The girl assumed that during each treatment, much more mana was consumed than expected. Another day passed, but Diana had difficulty getting out of bed, and her brother constantly monitored her condition. Diana was surprised that her brother postponed his date with Charlene to take care of his sister. Diana smiled and said, "Andrew is already so grown up and not a fool that he is simply blinded by love." This angered the brother so much that he slapped his sister in the cheek and shouted at her that he had always been an adult. Diana also got angry with Andrew and told him that he could have hit his sick sister. The next second, Andrew felt someone's presence and turned around to see the Duke. At first, he asked surprisedly how the Duke could enter the room so quietly. And then he started to apologize stupidly, saying it was a misunderstanding. And then Andrew saw Charlene in the doorway, who also saw everything that was happening. The girl asked if it was perhaps a joke, because Andrew couldn't do that to his sister. Then she added that she thought fire masters didn't get sick, and Andrew replied that he and his family were also very surprised when they found out. Then he talked about the doctor's assumptions that it wasn't a common cold. He added that at the meeting of mages and alchemists, they were sure that Diana had consumed too much mana, which caused her temperature to rise. The Duke listened to the conversations, but it seemed his thoughts were occupied with something else very important. Charlene whispered in Diana's ear that her brother was very worried about her condition yesterday. And at night, he learned from someone the news that Diana was sick, and immediately left the mansion. The girl's eyes were filled with surprise, which means that, after all, it wasn't a dream. She began to understand that all the caresses, hugs, and words of coldness turned out to be reality. But somewhere deep inside, she was still trying to convince herself that it wasn't true. She remembered that at some point last night, she felt cold and decided to return to the house. But before leaving, she touched Albert's cheek, and he seemed very real to her. The girl decided not to torment herself with conjectures and asked the Duke directly if he really came to her at night. The Duke looked at Diana and replied that he had indeed come to see her. In the next second, Diana simultaneously experienced two feelings of surprise and great embarrassment. Then she composed herself and said that she didn't remember at all how she got into bed. The Duke replied that it was natural, since Lady Diana fell asleep in his arms. Then he added that he felt very guilty towards the girl. After all, he is the reason why Diana is now sick. The girl replied that it was not the Duke's fault, because she herself volunteered to be the first to help him. And suddenly, Albert said that for the sake of Lady Diana's health, they should have all this. At that moment, Diana was horrified by what she heard and wanted to take the Duke's hand. But Albert withdrew his hand and asked what the lady was going to do. Diana looked at the Duke and replied that she was going to treat him as before. The girl added that they both know that there is simply no other way. Albert tried to say that he could bear it. Diana replied that she knew very well how much the Duke needed this, because she herself had been through this. The Duke replied that he would not allow Lady Diana's condition to worsen. Besides, since he was going to hide all this from his friend Charlene, it is possible that due to high energy consumption and mana, she would lose consciousness again. Diana replied that, in any case, Albert should not blame himself for everything that happened. She added that all this is due to the fact that she still doesn't know how to control her strength and energy. Diana looked at the Duke and told him that she still had to try again, and that, if it got worse, Albert would help her. The girl reminded the Duke that yesterday she felt so comfortable in his arms that she even managed to fall asleep. And today, her temperature dropped a little. The girl held the crystal in her hands and told the Duke that thanks to him, she felt better. Albert looked at Diana surprised and asked if she wasn't afraid. The girl replied that she had nothing to fear, because if something happened, the Duke would save her again. Diana placed the crystal in the Duke's palm and realized that at that moment, they really needed each other. After a while, the girl smiled and said that the treatment procedure was over. But in the next second, Diana realized that she was beginning to lose consciousness and feel very tired. But thank God, the Duke managed to catch the girl in his arms. Albert said that Diana had absolutely no strength and that he would carry her to bed himself. To fall asleep faster, he advised her to wrap herself in a blanket and headed towards the exit. Diana reached out her hand and asked if Albert could stay with her until she fell asleep. The Duke returned and, sitting on the bed, asked if he could hold her hand. Diana agreed and said that this way she would fall asleep faster. Albert wished the girl sweet dreams and told her that he would take care of her peace of mind. It was almost midnight when a kind of commotion started in the courtyard of the Raffaello estate. The stranger at the door claimed to be a gentleman from the north. The guards tried to drive the beggar away, telling him to beg elsewhere because he couldn't prove anything, since he had no documents. Naturally, the stranger could not confirm his identity because he handed his documents to the Duke. Eric said he would put on a helmet and only his eyes would be visible. Diego replied that as soon as he drew his sword, he could immediately reveal himself. Then he sighed and added that a storm was brewing and monsters began to attack the northern castle en masse, leaving their habitats. The assistant said that due to such circumstances, it would be very difficult to send a letter. Nathan suggested using a magic communication device and Eric replied that such a thing simply cannot be bought in the north. Moreover, if a person from the north had this, the emperor would immediately send people. So the assistant thought about it and said that the master's long absence could raise suspicion, and that a secret spy would find out about the duke's disappearance. Diego said that he could impersonate the duke and pretend that he had left the castle. The assistant expressed concern because he had never been so far away, and his disguise could be revealed. But Diego replied boldly that he was ready to accept that danger. He added that Eric doesn't have to worry about him and that he will try to avoid monsters as much as possible. And when checking an identity, he will resort to bribery or come up with something else. The security continued to pursue the stranger, and this only made the noise intensify. Suddenly, the Duke appeared and asked what caused the commotion caused by the guards. Sitting comfortably on the sofa, Diego said he felt very good after the shower. Albert asked what prompted Nathan to come here in this way, because everything was for a reason. The gentleman replied that he had come to escort the Duke to the north, and that they should leave immediately. The Duke immediately thought of Lady Diana, because if he wasn't around, she might be in danger. Nathan saw Albert's confusion and asked him if it was because the lady refused to go north. The Duke replied that initially he did not plan to take her there, because there was not even a garden to walk in. Diego said that, in any case, the Duke needed to make a decision. One of the reasons for Albert's confusion was the jealous attitude of Andrew's sister. And the second reason was Diana. He remembered the unusual feeling he began to experience with Lady Diana, and his heart began to beat faster than usual. The Duke fell silent and then said that just one day, and they would leave. Charlene picked up a beautiful bouquet of flowers in the garden and decided to give it to her brother so he could visit Diana. In the next minute, the door opened, and Charlene was surprised by what she saw next. Of course, she wasn't surprised by her brother's visit, but she was amazed when the second man appeared. The man smiled and introduced himself, saying his name was Nathan Diego. Charlene remembered the day her brother left for the north with him, but she didn't understand why he was here now. Charlene began to feel anxious and realized she was about to hear something important. Albert said that today is the last day they are together, and that tomorrow he will have to leave. Hearing this, Charlene dropped the bouquet of flowers and asked her brother why so suddenly. To some extent, she understood that her brother would someday go north, because he risked a lot trying to meet her. After all, Albert had to disguise himself and hide his identity for this. Charlene started crying and said that her brother promised her he would be here for a month. But now, they don't know when they will see each other. Her parents tried to forbid Diana from going outside until she recovered. But the girl said she was already completely healthy. But then Daisy appeared, and to stop this dispute, she showed Diana a bunch of gifts that had been sent to her. The girl laughed and said that it turns out being sick is not so bad. Then the maid handed the lady an envelope, telling her it was from Prophet Matthew. Diana took the envelope and, disobeying her parents, went out into the garden. From the letter, Diana learned that the prophet wanted to visit her immediately, but, unfortunately, in her situation, this is impossible, and he wishes her well-being and a speedy recovery. And suddenly, the whole sky was covered with clouds, and it began to rain lightly. Daisy quickly decided to take her mistress home, saying with annoyance that this should have happened as soon as she recovered. Upon entering, the maid said that a guest had just arrived and led her to the living room. It was Ryle. He smiled and said that Diana looked fine. The girl asked Daisy to close the door behind her and not let anyone into the living room. A little later, Ryle said that he thought everything was much worse, because Matthew told him that he saw the girl crying. Then he added that he was very worried about Diana, and that's why he started following her. But now Ryle sees that the girl has recovered and is very happy about it. In the next second, he stood up and said that he needed to leave urgently before the rain got worse. Diana indignantly said why he was doing this and believed he had the right to follow her. Ryle replied that he could not ignore the fact that Diana, who had never shown tears, was suddenly walking on the brink of life or death. For this, he contacted his friends Adelaide and Wolfgang. Diana, as soon as she remembered these two from her past life, tried to keep them as a backup. Adelaide was the queen of mercenaries, a responsible and strong woman. Everything always went well for her. Wolfgang was a wandering poet. He had no responsibility or nationality, and besides, he was the complete opposite of Adelaide. There was nothing in common between them, and they were only united by a mutual misunderstanding. And no matter how high their status was, no matter how much money they had, these two always did whatever they wanted. Diana chose Adelaide to subjugate or suppress, and Wolfgang only created the songs he wanted. Following in her footsteps, Diana smiled thoughtfully and said that she had to get over it. The next morning, Diana said she was going to the training ground and promised Daisy she wouldn't go beyond the estate. When Diana first realized that she had been reborn inside a novel, she lived on the training ground for whole days. At first, she only watched her father and brother train without trying to train herself. Then Diana began to train tirelessly until she decided to tie up the main characters. After finishing training, Daisy praised the lady and said she was excellent with weapons. Diana proudly replied that she was convinced that she hadn't rusted or lost her skills yet. And suddenly, the girl heard a familiar voice and turned around. It was the Duke brought by Brother Andrew in the next second. Andrew pushed Daisy out the door and told her they should be alone. Diana looked at Albert and was surprised that he was wearing armor. The girl smiled and asked if the Duke felt comfortable in this outfit in rainy weather. When Albert replied that he felt comfortable, the girl asked him why he had come alone without Charlene. The Duke replied that Charlene was in the carriage and only came in to say that she was leaving for the north. Diana was ready to hear anything, but not this. Albert added that the rain should stop and they could go out tomorrow. The girl lowered her head and asked again what it means that the Duke will leave as soon as the rain stops. Albert replied that Charlene insisted he come here and say goodbye to Diana. Diana replied that this means that if it weren't for Charlene, Albert would have left without saying a word to her. The girl perfectly understood that her sister only cared about the Duke's soul, so she was not surprised by anything. And then Albert said quietly that when he left Diana, he would not forget her. The girl looked at the Duke and said that due to the heavy and noisy rain, she didn't hear what he was saying. The Duke moved closer and said he was grateful to Lady Diana for everything. The girl replied that he was speaking as if they would never see each other again. Albert said that there are all sorts of situations in life, but being here because of her illness is a burden for his sister. And he didn't know it would be so difficult to return. The Duke moved even closer and wanted to add something, but suddenly the door opened. Charlene and Andrew, frightened, ran into the room and shouted that something was wrong with the gentleman Diego. The Duke turned around surprised, but Diana still didn't understand who they were talking about. Running to another room, the girl saw a gentleman lying unconscious on the floor. Diana immediately noticed the icy skin and cold breath, and immediately wondered if he had contracted magical poisoning. Andrew shouted that he needed to urgently move him to a convenient place and call a doctor. But Diana told him not to touch him or do anything. When the brother turned around surprised and said he needed help, the girl replied that she could help him. The Duke approached from behind and asked if Diana had the crystal with her, but she had already managed to get it. Charlene looked at her friend surprised and asked what she was going to do. Diana, without turning around, apologized for not telling her sooner, but now there is no time for explanations. For the moment, she had nothing to tell her friend, because if she found out the truth, she would still be angry. Diana just said that as soon as it's over, she promises to tell everything. But this is what happened 5 minutes before the gentleman lost consciousness. The Duke came to Diana to inform her that he urgently needed to go north. The gentleman managed to look secretly and discover that this was exactly the lady from the conversations. Charlene noticed that the gentleman was standing at the door of the room and reproachfully said that it was not good to eavesdrop. But before the Duke left Diana, the gentleman witnessed a conversation between Albert and his sister. Charlene told her brother that he should say goodbye to Diana because they were not strangers. The Duke replied that his sister was mistaken and that they were strangers to each other. The girl said he was lying and that he was simply scared. It was the first time in his life that the gentleman saw such an expression on the Duke's face. And as soon as Albert left, the gentleman suddenly sneezed and apologized. Andrew asked if everything was okay, and Diego replied that everything was fine and not to worry. A minute later, Charlene and Andrew noticed how Sir Diego's weight began to tremble. The gentleman tried to say that perhaps it was simply a reaction to the local weather. And suddenly, the next second, Sir Diego began to lose balance and consciousness and fell to the floor. Diana was already ready to use her energy, and Crystal to save the gentleman. But the next moment, someone grabbed her hand, preventing her from doing this. Diana looked up and was surprised that it was the Duke. And then Albert took the crystal from her and placed it in Andrew's palm. The Duke told him that he should try to use his fire energy on Nathan. Diana said surprised that he should have done so. But the Duke replied that he would not allow Lady Diana to lie down again. The girl looked at Albert and remembered that just a minute ago, he was leaving for AR. Without saying goodbye. Before Andrew could touch the gentleman, a blue light appeared around him. And Andrew exclaimed that he had the feeling that he himself was about to die. Diana told him that this was just the beginning, and that after a while this feeling would pass. Then Charlene quietly approached from behind and asked to explain everything that was happening here. Diana looked into her friend's eyes and told her that it seemed the time had come to tell her everything. After their conversation, the Duke said that Diana knew everything from the beginning. And he did not apologize for the fact that they kept silent. Charlene asked if a cure for magical poisoning had not yet been invented. The next second, the girl turned to Andrew and cried bitterly on his shoulder. Then she said that she regretted not knowing anything about it and resisted going north by all means. The Duke replied that this is why he didn't tell her anything, so that his sister wouldn't blame herself. Then he added that he wanted to remember those days as happy after so many years. Albert said he was happy only thanks to Charlene. The girl clung to her brother and cried even harder. And then the day came when Diana and Albert had to part. Charlene sat in the carriage while the Duke and Andrew walked away to talk. Diana turned to her friend again and asked for forgiveness. Charlene replied that everything was fine because they were friends. She understood that Diana remained silent only for the sake of her brother. Charlene added that she knows Diana did all this to protect her friend and it's good that she at least talked about it now. Then she thanked her friend for keeping her brother safe. Suddenly, Andrew appeared from behind and jokingly decided to scare his sister. And suddenly put his hand on her shoulder. Diana didn't like this very much because she was about to cry, so she was sensitive enough to be scared. But then the Duke approached and she began to calm down. Then he headed towards the carriage and said they had to leave. But then the girl called him and told him that he promised to come when the rain stopped. That is, tomorrow. Diana. Albert looked at Diana and said that maybe this would happen, and the girl said see you tomorrow then. Diana added that she would like to say goodbye one more time before the Duke leaves. But Albert didn't answer her and turned to Andrew. The Duke asked him to continue taking care of his sister Charlene as well. The young man replied that he would do everything possible to keep the girl safe. At that moment, Diana stood up and looked at the Duke with sadness in her eyes. It was pouring rain outside, and Diego asked the Duke if they could wait one more day. And Albert replied that this must be done right now. Then he reminded the gentleman that they only had one day left. The Duke told Andrew that it's not that he still doesn't like him, it's just that he sees that his sister becomes happy by his side. So he asked him to protect her. Diana remembered the Duke's last words, and it seemed to her that they would never see each other again. No, he shouldn't leave until the rain stops. But the girl couldn't cope with an incomprehensible premonition and decided that she needed to immediately go to the Raffaello mansion. Upon learning where her sister was going, Andrew followed her and told her that this was another reason to see Charlene. They had barely left the gate when they saw the guard talking to a messenger. Then he noticed Lady Diana and said that he had arrived from the palace by order of the prince. That he had found out about her illness. Then the messenger pointed to the mountain of gifts and said that it was from His Majesty. Diana thanked him and, asking him to leave all the gifts inside, got back into the carriage. The journey seemed very long to Diana, but finally the carriage stopped near the Raffaello mansion. Upon entering the hall, the girl realized that her premonition had not deceived her. Charlene told them that, despite the rain, the Duke and the gentleman had decided to leave today. Diana felt a bitter resentment because Albert had lied to her, and moreover, he was going. And coming at his whim. She couldn't understand why the Duke decided not to say goodbye to her, because it seemed to her that, during this time, they had become closer. Now he will return to the north. He will feel fine. He won't need her help for anything. Charlene looked at her friend and asked if everything was okay. Diana replied that she just wanted to see the Duke one more time, but since he had already left. She was going straight home. Without looking back, she told her brother that if he wanted to, he could stay with Charlene. Stepping out onto the porch, the girl saw that the rain had completely stopped and the bright sun had appeared in the sky. Prince Elvis was extremely surprised when he learned that Lady Diana hadn't even looked at the gifts she received from him. And when they informed him that the gentleman had secretly left the Raffaello mansion, and that Lady Diana had gone there in the morning, he decided that this did not seem like a coincidence to him. The servant replied that it also didn't seem like it could be just an accident. The prince's assistant added that he was able to contact that person in the north with the help of a magic stone the prince gave him. Since then, the Duke has not appeared in the north. This coincides with the period that the gentleman was here. Elvis, looking at the ring on his hands, said that there were too many coincidences. The prince put the ring on his finger and ordered him to leave it. The servant began to wonder how it was possible to leave everything like this, with so much work done. Elvis approached him, put his hand on his shoulder, and repeated once more that everything should be left as it was. And suddenly, by this touch, the servant felt his body begin to go numb and ceased to obey. And the room lit up with a bright violet light. The prince said that he had changed his mind, that the Duke was nothing important. Then he added that the most important thing now is that he got through it. The servant bowed, kissed His Highness's shoes, and said that he was completely right. Daisy entered the room and said that she was very worried about her mistress, because she was sitting here as if in captivity, and didn't go out. Then she said she had brought a letter, but Diana, without even asking who it was from, told her to leave it next to the bed. After a while, the girl took the envelope and was surprised to see that the letter was from alchemist Fernando. The letter said that he had created new proportions for a cure for magical poisoning, and asked that this time they unite. After reading the letter, Diana said she needed to go out, and Daisy offered to accompany her. The girl replied that she would go alone, but wondered how Fernando would react to the fact that the Duke had left. Upon arriving at the alchemist, Diana saw how annoyed he was by the Duke's departure. He was very worried about his work and now needed to look for a new experimental subject somewhere. Almost crying, Fernando said there were many things he hadn't managed to do yet. And the next second he changed and said that he could continue his work if he and Lady Diana went north. The girl was shocked by this proposal, but after a pause said she needed to think. The alchemist continued to persuade Diana and told her that there was no time to think. The girl asked what Fernando was going to do if she refused the trip. The alchemist replied that without Diana, it would be more difficult for him to create a medicine. But all means are good, and he will do anything, even if it takes him longer. But one way or another, he will go north to feel everything through the gentleman. Diana told Fernando that she would contact him later and inform him of her decision. Later, Diana went to the temple to meet Prophet Matthew. The blind prophet noticed that today the girl came alone, without her escort. When Diana told him that she had returned to the north again, Matthew replied that now he understood the reason for her tears. The girl replied that she didn't even cry during her illness, and that, therefore, the prophet's predictions were wrong. Matthew replied that Lady Diana was mistaken, because not only flowing tears can be called crying. He added that crying can be considered a state of mind when separating from a loved one. Diana thought the prophet was right, because although the Duke was not a friend, he was clearly a close person to her. She remembered how much she had done for him during this time, and Albert could easily leave without telling her anything. At that moment, she felt like an unnecessary wrapper that is thrown away after eating the sweets. Matthew said that her feelings and words serve as an attraction for the Argo, so that they will instantly rush to her aid. Diana did not immediately understand who the prophet was talking about until she heard a noise outside the door. As always, without ceasing to argue among themselves, Adelaide and Wolfgang entered the room. But then both saw Diana and said that they hadn't seen her for a long time. And that's why they were very happy to meet. When the girl asked how they were, Adelaide and Wolfgang began to complain about each other in a very funny way. Adelaide claimed that for her existing wounds were like an honor, and Wolfgang was like an idle grasshopper. Wolfgang replied that he deliberately travels to beautiful places, creates songs, and does not move his sword from left to right in vain. Diana held her head. It seemed to her that their arguments would never end. Finally, Wolfgang told the girl that he had always told her to take care of her health. And Adelaide asked if she still didn't feel very well after her illness. The girl smiled and said that she was fine now. The Duke sat in the cold, icy wind and realized that he felt nothing. In the capital, unlike the local weather, he felt chills and unbearable pain. At the same time, simultaneously with these sensations, he was enveloped in a previously unknown warmth. But returning to the north, the Duke could no longer recall this feeling. At first he regretted having fled and feared that, meeting Diana face to face, she would want to wait longer. Perhaps he was afraid to realize that they would never see each other again. There was a moment when the Duke wanted to be greedy, and after reality appeared before him, he left of his own free will. The Duke thought that perhaps he had done the right thing after all, but he could not understand why his heart felt heavier every day. The next day, an unexpected guest appeared at the Valerian estate. It was Princess Deborah. She said she felt uncomfortable about the reason she came here, and Diana replied that she could speak more bravely. Deborah looked at the girl and asked what she thought of her brother. Diana was very surprised by the question and replied that she thought of Elvis simply as His Majesty. Then she asked if the princess really came all this way just to ask that question. And Deborah replied that the prince really liked Diana. She said that during dinner, Elvis told his father, the emperor, that he had a mistress. Deborah looked at Diana and said that this mistress was definitely her. The girl replied that she had not given any reason to think so, and the prince went crazy. The next second, she was afraid that she had spoken like that in front of the princess about a member of her family. But Deborah tried not to pay attention to her and said that Elvis was actually not himself. Then she added that she thought things would go badly for her royal family, so she held back. But not with her brother. And if suddenly the prince confesses his liking to her, then Diana should interrupt him with the phrase that she is already dating the gentleman. The girl realized that the princess was referring to Duke Albert. Deborah got up and said that maybe she had gone too far. Diana replied that everything was fine, because she understood how the princess was worried about her brother since he arrived here. Deborah said she was a little jealous because Diana and Duchess Raffaello were good friends. And she didn't have those feelings for anyone. She appreciated that occasion and the meeting with Diana on the balcony, so she gathered her courage. And she came. It seemed to the girl that with that conversation, she might have changed the princess's character. The princess said that she couldn't find common ground even with her maids. So that day at the ball, she vented her anger on Charlene. Deborah admitted that apparently she doesn't know how to manage personal connections, and, therefore, she takes any conversation about herself seriously. The next moment, the princess was very surprised because Diana said that Charlene would help her. The girl stood up and added that even if someone is angry, apologizing sincerely will be enough. And everything will pass. Although she understands very well how difficult it is sometimes to apologize, Diana approached the princess. She hugged her and added that sometimes one has to act more bravely so as not to take offense. Deborah felt the warmth of Diana's hands and wanted to stay like that for as long as possible. After Princess Diana left, she wanted to close the door because she was a little tired from her visit and from His Majesty's gifts, but then her parents appeared and asked to open the door. Brother Andrew knocked on the door and asked if Princess Deborah had really come. But Diana didn't want to open it and decided to write down all the events that happened that day on a piece of paper. The first was a meeting with Prophet Matthew, who uttered significant words. The next thing was the sudden appearance of Adelaide and Wolfgang, then this visit from the princess, and the conversation about the prince. All this together was nothing more than an omen of a storm. Diana stood up abruptly and decided that it was necessary to urgently prepare for all this. The next second, the girl grabbed the hem of her dress with the leg of a chair and fell onto the bed. Diana realized why she couldn't concentrate. Duke Albert was the reason. She wanted to get the thoughts about him out of her head, but it didn't work, and Diana was ready to go north to give him a good shake by the neck. And then she remembered that the question of her marriage was beginning to arise, and if the king ordered it. Her father could not resist. Diana unconsciously compared Prince Elvis and Duke Albert and realized that Prince Promete was completely unsuitable. For a second, she imagined that her fiancé should be brave, handsome, indifferent, and cold to other women, and at the same time warm and gentle with her. Diana jumped up horrified, thinking she was portraying Duke Albert again. The girl decided that the only way to avoid marriage with the royal family was to flee to a place where they wouldn't catch her. Moreover, the girl understood that marrying the prince would undoubtedly make her and Princess Deborah fierce enemies. Many acquaintances who communicate well with her will turn their backs on her, including Rael. Unable to locate Diana, the father offered to go talk to her tomorrow. At that moment, Diana opened the door and said that it was very good that the whole family was gathered. She looked at her mother, her father, and then at her brother and firmly said that she was going north.